Hello and welcome to the second in our series on our fifth series on architecture and philosophy, where we'll be talking about the French philosopher Bernard Stiegler. This series goes back to 2020. It's kicked off with a lecture by Slavoj Žižek, and in that same series, back in 2020, we had Bernard Stiegler giving a lecture. Tragically, it proved to be the last lecture that he gave in his life, as he committed suicide about a week later. Very much in the tradition, I think, of French intellectuals who had committed suicide. Guy Debord, of course, and Gilles Deleuze also had committed suicide. Stiegler is one of the most extraordinary and enigmatic figures in some ways in the philosophical scene. He was imprisoned for armed robbery. He left school very early on during the kind of May '68 upheaval, and yet became one of the most established figures in the French intellectual scene. At the end of his life, he was in charge of the Institute of Research and Innovation in the Centre Pompidou. But what makes him so apposite today is that the way in which he engaged with topics like technology, and especially the question of AI and politics and time, really puts him at the forefront. I'm delighted to welcome back my two very dear colleagues from TU Delft, the Technical University of Delft, under Radman and Stavros Kousoulas, who've been part of this series for a couple of years now. It's been a very productive relationship, and we look forward to more sessions with them. I should add that Andrej Radman was the Digital Futures award winner, the Mark Cousins Award winner 2 years ago. So Stavros and Andrej, it's fabulous to welcome you here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Neil, for this generous introduction. Can I just check whether can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, so once again, before I start, let me thank Neil, Michael, and the entire team for the opportunity to once again contribute to this wonderful Digital Futures series on what architecture can learn from philosophy. Those who watch Saturday Night Live that just celebrated its 50th anniversary may be familiar with the custom that multiple hosts, such as Stavros and myself, get to wear a very special smoking jacket with a coat of arms printed on the pocket, bearing the number of hostings. In our case, it would be 4, as we already did a session on Gilbert Simondon, Henry Bergson, and most recently, Raymond Rouillet. With Bernard Stiegler, we continue the somewhat unfortunate series featuring male European dead French people. And as if this was not enough, we hint at a certain Gottfried Leibniz for our future Digital Future gig. Leibniz happens to be the topic of our current advanced PhD seminar, Architecture with a Twist, where we do a close reading of Deleuze's Fold, which luckily was made slightly less opaque now that we have access to the transcripts of his Vincennes lectures from 1987, which was the very last series of lectures before Deleuze retired. So Leibniz would earn us the number 5 on our Digital Future pockets. In any case, we have decided that I was to go first this time around with a kind of glossary of Stiegler's neologisms. And mind you, he was incredibly prolific in coining them, and this is probably an understatement. Stavros will then do what he does best, namely offer a speculative reading that draws on the philosopher's work, tangentially or obliquely, from what I understand. To mark the sad occasion of Stiegler's premature death that Neil already described in 2020, together with my colleague Robert Gorny, I have edited a special issue of Footprint, which is our architecture theory journal, open source journal, devoted to Stiegler's influence on architecture. You might remember Bob, our colleague from last year's session on Donna Haraway that he hosted together with our colleague Heidi Zohn. And if I'm not mistaken, this is probably the most successful presentation in judging by the number of visits on YouTube. I think it has close to 40,000 viewers. I invite you to check this footprint on Stiegler because it contains wonderful contributions by the likes of Claire Colebrook, who provided an anchor piece, which I really strongly recommend, where she really describes the concept of epiphylogenesis. Then there is a contribution by Gökhan Kodalak, who you might remember introduced Spinoza to the Digital Futures Architecture and Philosophy last year. And of course, my partner in crime, Stavros himself, who proposed to invert the premise by asking what is it that philosophy can learn from architecture rather than the other way around. And basically, both Kodalak and Stavros, Gökhan and Stavros, they are describing how is it that, to what an extent has Simondon contributed to the work of Stiegler's. Of course, in this issue of Footprint, you will find an extensive bibliography of all the Stiegler's work published in English to the date. Well, and as I already announced, my Digital Future introduction to Bernard Stiegler's philosophy in relation to architecture will take the format of a glossary. So let us start with the subtitle of my talk itself, the epiphylogenetic turn and architecture conceived in broad terms of the built environment, or even broader in terms of design. According to Stiegler, we transform our milieu as much as it transforms us. This is his famous line where he says, it is the what that makes the who, not just the who that makes the what. Moreover, this transformation occurs at an accelerated pace, from altered landscapes and directed buildings to cities to industrial and post-industrial hyper-exosomatizations, or that which goes beyond the body proper, the soma, which is, you might remember Delanda would qualify the city as an exoskeleton. So, and all this, in terms of Stiegler, he draws from Heidegger's concept of Gestalt to Vygotsky's technosphere to the most recent, we could call it artificial intelligence sphere, the sphere of artificial intelligence. So according to Stiegler, our surroundings are constituted by temporality and as temporality. Not just in terms of becoming, which is obvious, but also in terms of not thinking about the future, but about futurity, described as our perpetually transforming relation to past and present, a memory of the future, as it were, which sounds oxymoronic, but it's actually not. So here we go. The first comes the genetic memory. This primary memory is the information expressed in DNA that is passed down vertically by filiation from parents to offspring. So this is the first independent memory. Second, the epigenetic memory, or the kind acquired through a complex nervous system, which is, you could say, neither vertically nor entirely horizontally passed down. And in that way, it could be said to sit between the innate and acquired. The good example is spoken language. You are born into it, it pre-exists you, and you get coerced in using it properly. But of course, the second memory is gone when you're gone, when you die. Finally, the entire sausage, the epiphylogenetic memory, defined as the sedimented epigenetic differentiations within the spatio-temporal organization of material environments. So this is the transgenerational memory, which of course doesn't die when you die. In other words, this is a past that has not been lived, albeit capable of fashioning collective expectations or pretensions, as Husserl would call them. So this mnemotechnology is not inherited by vertical filiation like DNA, like the first memory, but acquired through horizontal alliances. The third memory, as my namesake Leroy Goran says, consists in the organization of inorganic matter, including writing, art, clothing, tools, and machines, but also filmmaking and especially architecture, because of its longue durée, to use the Bergsonian term. And it is humans and only humans that have access to this third memory, and we will see the implications of this shortly. So to recap, we have the first memory, genetic memory, filiation. We have the second memory, epigenetic memory, thanks to the nervous system. And finally, we have the third memory, which is transgenerational. And anytime I utter epiphylogenetic memory, it makes me think immediately of architecture. What is it that we actually do? The next entry to our glossary is architecture, or that with which we surround ourselves. That is that which we actively adopt rather than just simply merely passively adapt to. And you can already see that this is, I'm pushing for this neo-Marxist understanding of manipulation of the environment rather than just a vulgar take on conception of occupying the niche, already existing niche, the survival of the fittest, and so on. And here I'm just thinking that perhaps architecture in this way is best described by reference to a lovely piece from Schizoanalytic Cartographies by Guattari himself, with the title of Architectural Enunciation, and where he says, you know, in the past architecture might have been this or that, but today, and I think this applies for the early 21st century, it is its task is to modulate the sensible and relational lived experience. It is in that sense transmonadic. We will see what we mean by that. According to Raymond Rouillet, whom, as I said, Stavros and I introduced last year, complexity is determined neither by the presence of memory nor by its absence, but rather by the degree of memory's detachment from the body proper. And we have seen already in the cascade between the first, the second, and the third memory how this might work. In this sense, the animate has always been utterly dependent on the inanimate. And this is an argument that we develop in this book, Architecture of Life and Death. So in the book, we are arguing against the ingrained carbon chauvinism to show that indeed the animate is dependent on the inanimate. Detaching the memory from the organic changes the condition for further development, further phylogenesis, given that evolutions continue to be to get exorganized by associated technicized milieus. to refer to architecture by way of Simondonian trope. Once again, we introduced Simondon in our very first gig in 2021. Famously, Simondon distinguishes between 4 milieus: the interior milieu, the exterior milieu, the milieu of the membrane that mediates or regulates the exchange between the interior and exterior, and famously the associated milieu, which he says has to do with the respiration and action perceptions. In such a view, technics is not the opposite of life, but it's a catalyst of its evolution, or perhaps would be better to call it an involution. Technics is shorthand for organization of inorganic matter. As famous Stiglerian ritornello goes, it is a continuation of life by means other than life. Shorter still, it is a non-organic life, to use the title of Manuel de Landa's seminal essay from Incorporations edited by Quinter and Crary back in 1992. So neither organic nor inorganic, but non-organic life. The next entry in our glossary is transindividuation. Stiegler never grew tired of underscoring the ethico-political ramification of this important yet not fully appreciated Simondonian concept. As we know, there are different kinds of individuation, from again, another cascade from the physical to vital to psychical, and then finally psychosocial. According to the two compatriots, so Simondon and Stiegler after him, knowledge is not simply cognitive. Rather, it presupposes the formation of social circuits of transindividuation through which a form of knowledge is constituted. As a matter of fact, and this is now a punchline, transindividuation is only made possible by tertiary retentions, constituted by artificial organs. Again, this is what makes it transgenerational. That is to say, technics and mnemotechnics, or technicities in Simondon's terms. Stavros has developed this thoroughly in his book that he published with Rutledge in 23, The Architecture Technicities. These exo-organs, so these artifacts, are thus instrumental in generating sense or non-totalizing unities by linking psychic and collective individuations. And when I refer to sense, we should immediately take us to the realm of axiology, or theory of value, because as Stavros, as Stiegler points out in virtually all of his public appearances, so the fourth kind of this epiphylogenetic memory is a precondition is essential for transindividuation, and transindividuation can perhaps is a precondition of having an epoch to begin with. The noetic brain thus has always been constituted through its relation to a memory that is dead, as in the technologically spatialized temporal expression. In the words of a fellow Gibsonian, William Mace, and Gibson, J.J. Gibson is, of course, my hero, the founder of the ecological school of perception. This is what Mace says: ask not what is inside your head, but rather what your head is inside of. So again, ask not what's inside your head, but what your head is inside of. However, the inorganic memory has not entirely replaced the noesis of the living brain. The transgenerational articulation of singularities, by way of linking psychic individual brains epiphylogenetically, constitutes a radical auto-affective circuit between the dead and the living memory, what Stiegler calls hypomnesis and anamnesis. Parenthetically, according to Stiegler, the opposition of technical and living memory, the dead and the alive memory, necessarily posits the immortality of the soul, and thereby invents the soul itself. There's I think, a nice resonance here with monadology. To use respectively the three kindred anti-mechanicist concepts by Deleuze, Rouyer, and Deacon, Stiegler neganthropogenesis is quasi-causal, neo-finalist, and telodynamic. I hope to be able to flesh it out more thoroughly, maybe in the Q&A. This concept constitutes the lure of the virtual, as Didier Debye calls it, and so evades what Whitehead calls the fallacy of simple location, so excluding any and every possibility of non-local causation, and also the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, as we have learned from Deleuze that the opposite of concrete is not abstract, but it's discrete. It's the discrete. We will get to the definition of neganthropogenesis shortly, as we now switch from the early Technics and Time, Stiegler, to the late What's Wrong with the Anthropocene, Stiegler. And this transition is not as abrupt as some commentators make it seem. Before we do, let us touch on architecture or the built environment, which is the core concern of ours. So the question is, what may be the difference between the architect and the bee? In order to answer this question, we have to refer to grammatization, a concept that Stiegler appropriates from Derrida. So grammatization defined as a process of analytical formalization, discretization, reproduction, and automation. According to Stiegler, the question of grammatization as it pertains to the architect and the bee had appeared in Marx's Grundrisse, 1857, under the topic of exteriorization of knowledge into automatons and machines in general. Yet it was conspicuously and, according to him, fatally absent from his Das Kapital 10 years later. The concept is crucial insofar as the humans are noetic or capable of thinking, conceiving, and realizing conceptions precisely because their knowledge is not confined to their bodies. So, allow me to repeat this once again. The concept is crucial insofar as the humans are capable of thinking, conceiving, and realizing conceptions precisely because their knowledge is not confined to their bodies. Again, this idea of the cascading complexity that is measured by the proximity to the body, distance from the body proper. So thanks to the capacity for abstraction on the basis of epiphylogenetic memory, the third memory, architects conceive what they will build, whereas bees merely realize a structural coupling with their environment. Structural coupling is the concept that you probably recognize from Maturana and Varela. In other words, when it comes to the bees, such coupling occurs through an adjustment which is purely genetic and not epigenetic. By contrast, according to Stiegler, when it comes to architects, the noetic impression does not remain trapped within the endosomatic circuit, that is to say, between receptors and effectors, between action received and action executed in Bergsonian terms, which, of course, are the sensory motor organs of every living thing from the bee to the architect. So they are not trapped in this kind of endosomatic circuit. It is noetic only on the condition that it gives an expression which is exteriorized via artifacts, of which all transindividual expressions are layers. So it has to be exosomatized. Parenthetically again, in individuation in light of notions and form and information, Simondon claims that the real collective is transindividual That is to say, its reality is psychosocial and not purely social, as is the case with the insects. Yet, I insist, this is not to be misunderstood for advocacy of human exceptionalism. We have often been, Stavros and I have often been reproached for, going against the idea of bio-egalitarianism, but I think nothing could be further from truth. What we are saying here is that we have to take seriously the distinction between different modes of individuation. Perhaps we can touch on this in the Q&A. Since its onset with the Flintstone tools millions of years ago, to cave drawings in the Upper Paleolithic, to contemporary digitalization, exosomatization has been the very condition of noesis, of thought, of knowledge, of every kind. How to live, how to make, how to think conceptually, and how to think spiritually. So the ratcheting or irreversible evolution of hypomnestic technicities, is dead inorganic and non-organic technicities, thus remains contingently obligatory and not logically necessary. Now we move to the late Stiegler with the following 6 entries: entropy, negentropy, entropy, negentropy, and instead of the Anthropocene, Anthropocene, and eventually also neganthropocene that I've already mentioned earlier. The following set of concepts demands that we rethink entropy and negentropy in terms of that are related to, but different from, the attempted formalizations by information sciences and media theories. The anthropogenetic process is thermodynamic on the physical plane, that is entropic. Entropy is about the second law of thermodynamics, the heat death. And it is negentropic when extended to biology. And here Stiegler draws on Schrödinger's essay from 1944, What is Life? Interesting that the physicist tackled the difficult question. It is important to note that what Stiegler is offering, following Schrödinger's lead, is a theory of life and not of information. I stress this. It's a theory of relations and not of communications or interaction. According to him, the concept has been ignored by the Western philosophical tradition, with the notable exception of 2 people. One is Bergson in his Creative Evolution. Again, we presented Bergson in 2023 for the Digital Futures series. And the second one is Freud in his Beyond the Pleasure Principle. So in the strict sense, negative entropy would entail going backwards in time, which is impossible because time is not reversible. For only then would entropy be reversible, as it were. So Stiegler believes that it's better to conceive entropy as a local limitation, a temporary deferral of the ubiquitous entropic tendency. So the process of individuation is both anthropic, given its homogenizing or stabilizing tendencies, and neganthropic or exosomatic in Alfred Lotka's terms. I think this maps on the distinction between the idea of territorialization, stabilizing, and deterritorialization in Deleuze. Inspired by Levi Strauss, who thought that anthropology should be spelled as anthropology, Stiegler coins the term Anthropocene. Made me think that as we probably, as we believe that if we were ever to discover an alien civilization, it would probably be via its entropy. We have figured out that there is a civilization because it would produce entropy, accelerated entropy. And it is interesting also in that sense to maybe point out that Kevin Kelly, in his book from 2010, What Technology Wants, mentions a surprising fact that the chip that we use in computers is probably the most efficient gadget, dissipation machine in the whole of universe regarding its ratio between its mass, infinitesimal mass, and the incredible flow that pushes through this mass. So the ratio is, if I'm not mistaken, I have to check it, but it surpasses that of the sun. So again, this is contributes to the entropy. In any case, given the unsustainability of the Anthropocene due to its incredible increase of entropy, Stiegler advocates the adoption of negentropy as the criterion of every type of value. It becomes the value of values, if you want. Hence the neganthropocene, this term, capable of producing collective intelligence in the face of disindividuating entropic tendencies. Consequently, the entanglement of the inorganic yet organized and the organic yet exosomatic becomes an aesthetic, economic, technological, scientific, and philosophical question par excellence. So this, just to repeat, this might as well be a lovely definition of architecture of something that is inorganic yet organized, and also the entanglement with the organic yet exosomatic. So organic but not in the body, and inorganic and yet organized. Notoriously, for Stiegler, entropy equals stupidity. And stupidity is shorthand for getting closer to the mean. In a word, disindividuating, or approaching a behavioral average, thanks to which one loses one's singularity. It's a production of mediocrity. It's about the production of platitude upon platitude upon platitude, something that I think Sanford Quinter never gets tired of emphasizing in all of his work. So this is especially pertinent, as you might imagine, in the age of algorithmic governance, based on the so-called artificial intelligence. We have, I mean, perhaps we are all familiar with this problem of resonance chambers, and personally I draw on the work of Wendy Chun, who talks about homophily, that these resonance chambers becoming ever smaller, but also the work of Antoinette Rouvard, who recently delivered a lovely, very important keynote in the conference that we organized last year on the topic of intelligence archiving and instituting. And we have published in the footprint issue that I mentioned already, there is an extended interview with Antoinette Rouvard, where she is hammering. She has like 20 recommendations of what is it that we need to stop doing. And out of 20, allow me just very quickly to read 5 that I singled out. So she says, we ought to stop. 1, reducing singularities or processes of individuation or subjectification to particularities. We ought to stop reducing politics to the juxtaposition of individual interests. We ought to stop reducing foresight to the extrapolation of past trends. We ought to reduce life to flows of digital information, and we ought to reduce existence to pure presence, the metaphysics of presence. So this is just 5. I invite you to, it's an open source, again, to read the rest of the list of, please. So moving on, if the smart city accelerates entropy instead of deferring it, and it does so by destroying knowledge, then what persists is, Stiegler says, artificial stupidity. This is an eponymous piece from 2018. By the way, this year's Venice Biennale under the selector Carlo Ratti is devoted to the topic of intelligence. They spell it with an S at the end, and we are invited to be a part of the public program, and we have decided to do a roundtable on the topic of the working title, "Who is Stupid Now?" So we will keep you posted on that. So to continue with Stiegler, if negentropy is vital, negentropy is noetic and irreducible to calculation. So it goes beyond the purview of STEM education. Noetic psychic individuation, that is thinking, is conditioned by technical individuation and not determined by it. The epiphylogenetic memory opens up a field of unlimited possibilities. We see this as a possibility of defatalization, for better or for worse. It is a pharmacon, Stiegler insists, a poison that can become a remedy, a poison that can be a remedy or vice versa, a remedy that can become a poison. It is both a friend and enemy, like Guattari's chaosmosis, or Joyce's chaosmosis, where order and chaos are intertwined. So our existential milieu is thus metastable insofar as epiphylogenesis continuously rearranges the enabling constraints, and does so by unnatural couplings, aberrant nuptials, that escape both vitalism and mechanicism. The lesson for architecture could not be more clear. Neither ghost nor the machine, to use the title of Jeremy Sherman's book from 2017. And perhaps this is why we are so excited about our current course on Leibniz under the banner of the fall. Perhaps this is one way of escaping this deadlock between the ghost and the machine, because it has to do with the folding of the body and the soul. So it is high time for a thorough ecologization of thought. To paraphrase Marshall McLuhan, ecology starts when nature ends. So the digital stage of exosomatization it's obvious, presents an unprecedented challenge, despite the fact that artificial intelligence may be seen as a continuation of the process of exosomatization of noesis. The sheer speed of algorithmic operations surpasses our attention capacity to such an extent that the usual inscribing of the psychic apparatus onto the circuits of transindividuation fails. And Stiegler calculated that the traffic that goes through optical cables is 40 million times faster than our nerves. So I don't know how you calculate that, but it's impressive in itself. In other words, the energy of the drives, because of this mismatch, is prevented from being diverted and economized. According to Stiegler, the unwitting internalization of tertiary retentions short circuits the cerebral elaborations derived from attention forms acquired in the course of education. So we're talking here about the mismatch between culture and technology. And perhaps this is why Yuk, who is so keen on tackling this issue, I think it technically goes under the name of technophony, and there's an eponymous journal devoted to this idea of reconciliation between culture and technology. The Simondonian formula, the knowledge of individuation is itself the individuation of knowledge, may be breached with automated governance, triggering archaic automatisms inaccessible to noetic channeling. This is you see the resonance here with the Adorno and Horkheimer cultural industry. I mean, we are fed these things so much in such a way that we cannot literally make sense of them. By taking control of the cerebral and drive-based automatisms and compulsions, the digital tertiary retention effectively turns toxic in Stiegler's understanding. And we are reminded by him by toxic, he believes that this is the whole point of the so-called neuromarketing. You know, when you click on to order a book and it tells you, people like you read also these books, or these people like you also listen to this podcast and so on. So you simply are, I suppose that in the Q&A we will, Stavros does develop this idea that perhaps instead of thinking in terms of the formula of minimal effort and maximal efficiency that is being kind of promoted in this neuromarketing fashion, perhaps we should consider the opposite of the idea of maximal effort with the minimal efficiency in order to maybe reclaim the process of transindividuation or psycho-collective moment that can create an epoch in that case. So, of course, as already hinted at, the toxicity here is defined as that which cannot be transindividuated. When automated understanding becomes purely computational, that is analytic, it short circuits the synthetic function of reason. Function of reason is Stiegler gets it from Alfred North Whitehead. By contrast to reason that relies on some kind of deliberation or inserting the interval between the action and perception, computing is in its function the faculty of understanding and thus exactitude. However, while fully dependent on calculation, the noetic remains irreducible to it. The conflation, collapsing of the vital and the noetic, or their full coincidence in that sense, would result in what Guattari calls the black hole in schizoanalytic cartographies. Conversely, it is precisely the incommensurability of the actual and the virtual that makes transindividuation possible and negentropy thinkable. So the map is not the territory, and it's good that it stays that way. This is, of course, crucial for the project of defatalization. So what then might be the consequences for the digital turn for architecture, of this digital turn for architecture design? Stiegler's response is unequivocal, and it involves his concept of proletarianization. According to him, contemporary designers get progressively proletarianized, that is to say, de-skilled, insofar that they have become manipulators of concepts derived from automated understanding. This kind of understanding is devoid of synthesis that emerge as a result of reason's primordial function, and that would be disautomatizing. So that's the thing. When automatic pretension replaces the noetic ones, architects become bee-like. We are like bees. That is to say, devoid of capacities for synthesizing pretensions, converging towards an end. And I say not, and it's an end, not the end. What is short-circuited by the transformation of noetic necromass into calculable data, subject to the analytic calculable proximal causality, is the causal efficacy of the non-pre-established finality, that is to say, the realm of virtual value. No wonder that Stiegler devoted his fourth volume of Technics and Time to quasi-causality. It was published briefly on academia pages by his lifelong associate Ross, his translator, but then it was removed. I was lucky enough to be there just on time to pick it up. I think there might be like a problem with the copyright problem with his children of, but you can find it if you look hard enough. So this Deleuzian concept, the concept of quasi-causality, was supposed to offer a therapeutic reversal of the toxic pharmacological condition. The full title is the Technics TNT 4, and the subtitle is the post-truth era. arguably, the conceptual resources for such a reversal had been laid out by Raymond Rouyer. I think we already argued this in his project of neo-finalism that was more recently revamped by the contemporary neuroanthropologist Terence Deacon, who coined the quasi-causal, the kindred concept of teleodynamics. And even more recently, in 2023, by his frenemy Alicia Huarero, in her book Context Changes Everything, published as an open source with the MIT Press. Just to briefly pause to suggest to Neil and Michael and the crew, you might want to invite Huarero. She was a guest at our PhD research 2 sessions, and she's a very original thinker who independently got to many of these concepts. So the stakes are high, given that the contemporary digital stage of exosomatization is driven by effective material, possibly even formal causality, but not the final. That's the holy grail, I think. Where it's that realm where values are to be found. And of course, through Masumi, we know that value is too valuable to be left to computation. Such a state of affairs nurtures and is nurtured by the proletarianization of all forms of knowledge. According to Stiegler, the resultant generalization of functional noetic deficiencies result in what he calls noetic cretinism. Raymond Rouillet's absolute survey as immediacy without objectification, what Samuel Alexander calls self-enjoyment, in kinship with Deacon's intentionality, could be seen as architecture's royal road to the synthetic and virtual auto-affection. Deacon prefers intentionality to intentionality, so spelling it with an E rather than I, because there is no necessity for a goal to be consciously, to be in a conscious representation in the mind, as it were. Breaking out of the parametricist all-too-analytic actual entrapment is a crucial step in the direction of deproletarianization, as Stiegler sees it. A near synonym of deproletarization is heterogenesis. That's a Guattarian term, a concept that breaks the deadlock between the ostensible immediacy of the subject and the constitutive distance of the system itself. In contrast to the evolutionary mechanism of passive adaptation, so fitting the already existing niche, and thus of reactionary disposition, the quasi-Lamarckian mechanism is active. It is as cultural as it is natural, given the ideality and materiality of its flaws that reach far beyond the anthropic. Epiphylogenesis is thus perpetuated by what Georges Canguilhem, who was the Simondon's mentor, called the infidelity of the milieu, a ceaseless technological disruption of what we see as a possibility of defatalization. Technical innovation inevitably disrupts our milieu and ourselves within it. In Technics and Time 1, Stiegler recounts the myth of the Prometheus idiot brother who was assigned with the task of distributing qualities to animals. And so Turtle got his its mobile house, Gazelle its speed, Lion its strength, and when it got to us humans, he realized that the bag is empty, and we have no, in other words, we have no predetermined qualities, and that's wonderful. In other words, the post-Darwinian exosomatic evolution, which is at once anthropic and negentropic, as I said, territorializing and deterritorializing, has become organological and not just organic. As such, it actively contributes to the mutation of boundary conditions and the concomitant enabling constraints. Again, reference to the book of Huarero. context changes everything. The outcome is not subject to mere adaptation, that is to say optimization, but of adopting a milieu and of individuating oneself while individuating the milieu. Succinctly put, and this is as good a definition of architectural technicity as any. Succinctly put, the milieu is metastable, always at the limit of equilibrium and disequilibrium. The fusion of noesis and noema would result in arrested development. To think differently, you have to feel differently, no? Although there cannot exist a comprehensive theory of exosomatization, this short glossary outlines the bootstrapping process whereby the noetic and the vital are co-constitutive, constituting the third kind of knowledge or power of action that is at the same time the knowledge of self. This is developed in Spinoza, Vincent lecture, among other things. So, to conclude, in the words of Stiegler himself, mortals are technicians, and as such, they never stop inventing, and through that, inventing their destiny. We haven't got the predetermined qualities, so we have to figure out what is it that we can still do and how to develop ourselves in this anthropogenetic sense. So allow me, in the spirit of open source that is advocated by Digital Futures against the paywall policy, one last product placement, the new book series, Ecologies of Architecture, where we managed to produce not one, but two volumes in the past year that more or less explicitly refer to the Stiegler's legacy. I thank you. With this, I close, and I thank you for your kind attention. Thank you.
Do I go ahead immediately or what?
Yes, Stavros, yes. We'll have questions at the end. Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Thank you, Andrej. Thank you. It was amazing.
I didn't know you wanted to say a word. Okay, let me share my screen, and I solved the issues, as you can see, so at least you will see me and hear me. Yeah. Okay. You do hear me, right? You do hear me, and you do see me also.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, and you'd also see my my presentation, right? I suppose.
Yes.
Good. So I get it going. Okay. As Andrej said, I will do it a bit differently, or I would do it in the same way we always do it. What do I mean by that? I will be speaking about Stiegler, but I will not be speaking about Stiegler simultaneously, in the sense that I will be speaking about Stiegler, but I will not be referring to him, neither directly, at least, to most of the concepts that Andrej just outlined. But in spirit, it's what I'm going to be going through. It's very much well versed into Stiegler's thought. I personally, however, cannot really easily distinguish Stiegler's thought from a series of other thinkers to which I think Stiegler both owes some of his big parts of his work, but to which I also think that when seen together, Stiegler makes much more sense. And in a way, even though it's not going to be at the central focal point, I think architecturally also Stiegler makes much more sense when he's brought together with other allies and not just by himself. So let's see. We start from where we start. We start from a question which is a very provocative question, and in a way, it's also a play with Stiegler's favorite semi-god Prometheus. So I will go one level higher, and it will have to do with the mother of gods now, not with any god specifically. Because for the ancient Greeks, the gods did have a mother, and that mother, this primordial deity, was the goddess Anangi. Anangi, and I'll explain what it means. Anangi, which emerged at the very dawn of creation, She emerged in a serpentine entanglement with her brother Kronos, which is the personification of time in Greek. Interestingly, Anangi starts for a very particular notion, and one that might surprise the reader who wonders why would the Greeks consider her as a mother of gods. The etymology of her name comes directly from the noun that stands for necessity. So the mother of gods, and also the sister of time, is necessity. And to make things even more peculiar, this very same noun has many meanings, and simultaneously it stands for necessity, but also for force, and crucially, for the argument I want to put forward, it stands also for constraint. So the mother of gods is Anangi, she's the sister of time, and what she means is basically necessity, force, and constraints. So now from a philosophical perspective, much closer to our times, up from the early ancient Greek philosophy up to Sigmund Freud and Norbert Wiener, Anangi, the mother of gods, has always been presented as the personification of determinism. And especially for cybernetics and Wiener, the prominent figure of early cybernetics, Wiener, Anangi always was opposed to Tyche, which was the goddess of chance and unpredictability, or what Wiener was calling quantum indeterminacy. So through a slightly architectural reconsideration of necessity, what I will highlight today would be that we should never conflate her, the goddess, we should never conflate her with determinism, neither oppose her to indeterminacy. What we could do would be to connect necessity with constraints, and both of them with a radical understanding of synapses, as well as by going through figures such as Gilles Deleuze, Félix Guattari, Raymond Druyer, and Gilbert Simondon, propose a Stiglerian, in spirit, re-evaluation of architecture that makes constraints a presupposition for the emergence of any sensitivity to indeterminacy. So, as our dear friend, artist and researcher Patricia Reed reminds us, in the most straightforward way, necessity can be understood as that which cannot be otherwise. So anything that is not necessary is contingent. Reed continues by claiming that necessity is axiomatic insofar as what is necessary remains so regardless of situational specificity, and furthermore it's resistant to contradiction, logically speaking. Necessity operates as a conceptual and material constraint since it determines what is not freely negotiable and what is not subject to alterability. So if we follow this very brief argument of Reed, the connection between necessity and constraints can become more obvious. If something cannot be otherwise, then its resistance to change stands as a determining factor for any potential interaction with or any system that's part of it. Moreover, for Patricia Reed, there are two fundamental types of necessities. There are alethic necessities and non-alethic necessities, both originating from the Greek word aletheia, which means truth. So in other words, there are necessities that are absolutely true, regardless of context, and necessities that are non-absolute and context-sensitive. If we follow this distinction, to claim, for example, that human life depends on nutrition, or that plants depend on solar energy, that is an alethic necessity. However, to claim that a good human life, and that's Stiglerian in spirit, to claim that a good human life depends on this kind of nutrition or that kind of architecture is a non-alethic necessity, precisely because it would essentialize and reify a particular understanding of what it entails to live a good life. So what Reed is ingenious is that she makes clear through a line of argumentation that I'm not going to follow for practical reasons now, she makes clear that there has been a continuous naturalization of necessity, especially since Darwin's theory of evolution since the late 19th century, which eventually also led to a biologically based reconsideration of many other disciplines. So to put it simply, there is a constant and deliberate confusion where non-alethic, non-truthful, let's call them like that, necessities are intentionally taken for truthful alephic necessities, and eventually later on serve as the supreme source of legitimacy for diverse contemporary political, economic, and social structures. Another way to address non-alephic necessities would be as norms and values. Non-alephic necessities are norms and values. So norms as established patterns of action and values as desired outcomes of those actions. Why would we suggest such a twist? Because it's through action itself that the binary between the alephic and the non-alephic can be dismantled, allowing for neither a naturalization of necessity, nor for all sorts of kinds of anthropomorphic reductionisms. So on the contrary, if we develop an account of norms and values, and that will be central in this short talk, if we develop an account of norms and values that presupposes only the affective power of activity, then we can have a different and reverse trajectory, which could be outlined as following. How could we denaturalize alephic necessities and in that sense destabilize the very foundation of any scientific or other kind determinism? A very illuminating, and the pun is intended, a very illuminating example in this direction is given by another dear friend, philosopher Joel White. Joel White asks, what if we were to seriously consider that the sun is actually dying? And that's a Nietzschean line of thinking. So White revises Nietzsche's interest in the heat death of the sun and claims that if the sun, as the metaphor of the form of all forms, grounds and engender the truth of our thinking, if we were to see it as dying, then as Nietzsche argues, all our epistemological truths would invert into a lie. For Wyatt, the inevitable, and I put a question mark next to inevitable, the inevitable entropic death of the sun takes actually this inversion one step further. It's not only epistemological truth that is inverted, but according to White, all kinds of truths, especially ontological truths, or put differently, alephic necessities, are also inverted. As he is saying, the truth of the entropic living and dying, analogically represented by this living and dying star that we call our sun, allows us to grasp the truth of entropic form. While heat death cannot be for us an object of experience, it is certainly with us. The entropy of the universe increases each time we heat our houses. Remember what Andrej was saying about alien civilizations, we will find them through their entropy. When we think our thoughts and when we let our coffees get cold. Indeed, this absolute oblivion is the unpalatable truth at the end of our search for knowledge. It's this truth that inverts all other truths to lies. So what White is essentially claiming is that if we agree on the truth of a second law of thermodynamics, what we call entropy, then we are unwittingly abolishing also the very notion of truth itself. Being able to envision an entropic death, being able literally to envision it in our heads and also envision it, for example, in the image I'm showing you, being able to envision an entropic death is only possible because of a continuous, constant, and stubborn efforts to avoid the inevitable, to avoid entropy itself. You see, we're in a deadlock here. So how do we avoid that inevitable? We do avoid it by introducing negative entropy. Remember the neganthropocene of Stiegler that Andrej was referring before. So if negative entropy is what makes any form of structural and operational organization possible, from rocks and houses to our hearts and to our institutions, to this very meeting, then truth itself is no longer stable and fixed. Truth becomes metastable, Andrej mentioned the term, and I will also add to that, it becomes autonormative. We will see what this means. So if the truth of negative entropy, which following its use in information theories and for the sake of this short talk, I will call negentropy. So if negentropy is the only viable truth in the ontological sense of the term, then if we follow again Reed's argument, negentropy becomes the primary alephic necessity out of which all the other non-alephic necessities emerge. In other words, our norms and values are continuously produced negentropically. This implies a very drastic shift. If negentropy is the only truth, then no truth is stable, no truth is predetermined. Alephic necessities are denaturalized on the basis of this immanent contingency of continuous negentropic interventions on this very fibrous of the cosmos. It's not a coincidence, speaking of fibrous, it's not a coincidence, therefore, that our goddess, Anangi, was always depicted holding a spindle where you are actually weaving fibers. The spindle of Anangi was assembled by a shaft and a steel hook, while the wool of the fibers was made of different metals and other materials. This wool was an unusual kind of wool, being made of many entangled pieces that in the way that they were entangling, while she was spinning the spindle, the cosmos was composed. It's also how Plato, you know Plato, how Plato describes this process in his Republic. The nature of the wool is like this. Its shape is like those we have here. But from what he said, it must be conceived as if in one great hollow wool, completely scooped out, lay another like it, but smaller, fitting into each other as balls fit into each other. And there is a third one like this, and a fourth, and four others. For there are 8 worlds in all, lying in one another with their rims showing us cycles from above, while from the back they form one continuous whirl around the stem, which is driven right through the middle of the 8th. Each of these whirls stands for different planetary bodies, according to Plato and the ancient Greeks, from the moon and the sun to Saturn and Mercury, Venus, Mars, and Jupiter, while the larger one, the latest, is the cosmos itself, the whole fibrous universe. One more coincidence here, speaking of a fibrous universe. Philosopher Raymond Druyer, that Andrej also mentioned, the author of the seminal neo-finalism, he also has conceptualized the universe as one of having a fibrous structure. His approach, however, prioritized a much more active and immanent entanglement. Druyer claims that this fibrous structure of the cosmos is the one that structures itself in time, and each fiber is expressing a line of individuation. For Druyer, the universe starts to fold in space and in time, and what is produced in these folds is never separated from the whole itself, even if it allows the whole to differentiate, to rearrange itself in this particular manner that each fold is actually expressing its folding. So besides understanding the universe as fibrous, Druyer also asks us to understand, as I mentioned in the beginning, to understand matter as activity. If we understand matter as activity, then matter becomes inseparable from time, since time can no longer appear as an empty and foreign frame. The time of action is inherent to this action as a temporal melody. That's what Druyer calls it. Time as a temporal melody of action. So for Druyer, the universe in its fibrous structure is the expression of lines of activity and not lines of subsistence. The subsistence of things derives from their activity. It's not required a priori by reason or virtue of a principle such as nothing is lost, nothing is created. Activity in its unfolding is not subject to any deterministic causality. The very folding activity of those individuations generates a rhythm that pulsates through the universe and potentializes their futures, the way that their future is going to be moving. The manner and the style of Anangi's intricate hand movements, her bodily and affective engagements with the spindle itself, express the cosmos as it is, not because it's supposed to be expressed as such, as if there is a rule to be followed, but because the only truth it obeys is the truth of this negentropic contingency, expressed in what Druyer understands as the continuity of activity. And if we wish to examine that continuity and complexity of activity, we should not focus neither to the infinitely small, micro-reductionism, nor to the greatly vast, macro-reductionism. But we will need to focus in the cross-scale interactions between different fibers, between different worlds, from large to small and back, and in the way that in their coming together through constraints, they eventually produce new constraints themselves. To do so, let's take a very quick basic science detour. So the first law of thermodynamics, as we briefly mentioned, postulates that the conservation of matter and energy is the most determinate truth we can have about the cosmos, meaning that neither of the two, matter nor energy, can be either created or destroyed. So while they shift from the one to the other, matter and energy, the total amount of both within the universe will always remain the same. That's the first law of thermodynamics. The second law of thermodynamics, what I called as entropy before, claims that all energy tends to gradually be more diffuse and in less structured forms. So even though the certainty of the second law of entropy is almost, and this almost, we need to underline it, is almost inevitable, it is this almost, again we underline that, absolute certainty that allows for the emergence of any form that has a degree, even a minimum degree, of structural and operational coherence and consistency. So this movement against the grain is what we have already called negative entropy, negentropy. At this very moment, things take an interesting turn. What assists, what helps in the preservation of the second law, which is an increase in entropy, or what contributes to its disrespect, what is negative entropy, is how different constraints from different scales as well are coupled together, how different constraints come together. How different constraints come together can propagate entropy or can, for a temporal interval, increase negative entropy. So how the large-scale constraints of Ananke coupled with the small-scale constraints of her hand movements, as well as with the constraints of the spindle itself, this whole complexity determines the very activity of the cosmic world. And in doing so, it literally sticks its tongue out disrespectfully to the second law. What do constraints do? Following another figure that Andrej mentioned, neuroanthropologist Terence Deacon, constraints can be colloquially understood as an external limitation that acts as an imposed factor that reduces options and possibilities. Deacon immediately suggests that we should stay away from referring to constraints as external, since any extrinsic account of constraints would assume that there is an n+1 level that we can observe things. Instead, Deacon claims, it's useful to have in mind the very etymology of the term constraint. The term constraint comes from the Latin constrictus, which is a past participle of constringere and stands for that which binds together. So constraint literally means that which binds together. In other words, constraints bring things together. They bring fibers, they bring strings together. They bind the fibers of individuation while Ananke, our goddess, spins her spindle. So one way to understand constraints is as a reduced variety that, however, in bringing things together, allows for novelty to emerge. It might seem contradictory as a definition, since reduction in variety implies a decrease in attributes, colloquially. However, as Deacon underlines, when some process is more constrained in some finite variety of values of its parameters or in the number of dimensions, its configuration states and paths of change will more often be near previous ones in the space of possibilities, even if there is never exact repetition. This is the Deleuze's difference repetition, by the way, but we can expand on it in another time. This is the entry point to understand constraints, especially in their connection to synapses. Constraints allow for a difference to repeat itself, forcing itself to differ so as to cross through the fibrous spinning of a spindle. By forcing themselves to differ, difference generates the capacity to intensify activity, precisely because it generates the need for the creation of new constraints that will later regulate its passages. As Deacon claims, it's only because of a restriction or constraint imposed on the release of energy that a change of state can be imposed by one system on another. It's precisely by virtue of what is not enabled, but could otherwise have occurred, that a change can be forced. So, the nature of a constraint indicates which differences can and cannot make a difference in any interaction. This has two consequences. Whenever existing variations are suppressed or otherwise prevented from making a difference in any interaction, they cannot be a source of causal influence. But whenever new constraints are generated, a specific capacity to do work is also generated. So through activity, wild and free activity, without anything external imposed to it, constraints are entangled with one another, folding into one another, being of the whole, while allowing the whole to rearrange itself, precisely because a constraint at one level will assist in the emergence of a constraint at another level. It's in the very manner that constraints fold that a negentropic stubbornness allows for the synaptic passage of an intentionality that depends only to how sensitive to indeterminacy we are. And in that manner, that specific style that each negentropic effort expresses is what allows for the passing through of an intensity that literally informs the cosmos. So one might wonder what all these things that I'm saying have to do with architecture. The response, as always, is not very clear because it's not meant to be clear. But I am claiming that considering all these things seriously involves a radical reevaluation of architecture, or even broader, of design itself. And the reason for such a reevaluation is not just discursive, it's not a caprice. On the contrary, understanding architecture otherwise might make us able to get further attuned with Ananke's delicate hand movements. The first and most crucial step is actually to pluralize the architectural act itself and position it in terms of what philosopher Gilbert Simondon calls technicities. So I'm going to do a very brief overview, but the briefest possible, of what Simondon means when he coins the term technicity. Simondon says that if we aim to avoid reductionism and take our study beyond technical objects in an isolated manner, we should actually focus on examining the technicity of these objects as a mode of relation between humans and the world. In this sense, we can move from, I put that word now, architectural objects to architectural technicities that operate in terms of reticularity, reciprocity, the immediate relation of events and actions that happen in a given structure, which, however, should be understood in terms of the potentials for action that the structure has, and not just on its outlines and shapes. Technicity, Andrej mentioned that as a Stiglerian motto, technicity can be understood as evolution by means other than life. And simply put, technicity deals with how humans relate to and transform their environment through technology, and how these relations transform in their turn humans, technology, and environment altogether. It's a continuous flow. As such, thinking with technicities is a radically immanent way to approach the coupling of different constraints, human constraints, technological constraints, environmental constraints, without imposing any external dimension, no n+1. And in this regard, architecture, in the very act of architecting, is privileged with an extremely valuable designerly insight into both the folding of constraints, that's what we do all the time, and the negentropic rearrangement of the cosmos. That's another thing we do all the time. We continuously rearrange the world. So let's examine a humble architectural technicity, tiling a floor. Strangely, this humble example of tiling a floor explains in an astonishing manner the coupling between constraints. It does so because it responds to the most basic cohomological problem. Cohomology is a very basic, let's say, I'm not going to go to that now. We can do it in the discussion if it's not clear. Anyway, the tiling of a floor expresses one of the most basic cohomological problems. How do modular quantities distributed under only local constraints can fit together globally over the surface, the manifold, that they attempt to cover? Moreover, and this is where exactly any technicity emerges, how could the shape of the floors, of all the floor of a manifold, be remodeled so that previously ill-fitting modules, ill-fitting tiles, can now cover it perfectly? So if we assume that there is a limited number of tiles, that's the first law of thermodynamics, the problem would be how to cover a floor with given dimensions using the exact number of those tiles. That's the second law of thermodynamics. In this sense, and now I'm quoting Kugler and Shaw, who have written a very nice piece on cohomology, the cohomology problem is how to find a distribution function by which the tiles will exactly fit the room without being added or subtracted from that room. Surprisingly, even Leibniz was bothered with precisely this cohomological problem, the fitting of a floor with a fixed number of tiles. So the initial condition, amount of tiles, size of the floor, is always constrained by what the final condition must be, while the boundaries set by the first law, the tiles, can be satisfied or violated by the second law, how do we fit them, only to give birth to a radically unexpected new boundary condition. Again, this is the problem of cohomology, and also this is the blissful capacity of architecture to resolve it. The cosmos might be materially and energetically closed, but it always remains relationally open. Matter and energy are fixed, but how we can relate them is infinite, is open. One can always relate the tiles differently, in a different manner, in a different style, in order to go against the second entropic law, while respecting the amount of tiles, while respecting the necessity of the first. In other words, while no matter or energy can be introduced or removed from the cosmos, there is literally no limit when it comes to the potential relations between them. The cosmos has an infinite potential for individuating otherwise, precisely because what drives it is neither matter nor energy. What drives it is information. Novelty, therefore, is always one technicity, one informational change away. So what I argue is that architecture in its very technicities can harvest differential relations and therefore produce constantly new information. Simondon will claim that information, far from the unfortunate contemporary confusion we might have with confusing information with data, information beyond data is a universal process that concerns all being, and it's actually the formula of individuation, the sense according to which a system individuates. It's a requirement for individuation, but it's never a given thing to be measured in bits and bytes, words or numbers. In simple terms, information, and that's Gregory Bateson saying so, information is a difference that can make a difference. In even simpler terms, information is the potential that can energize another potential. What kind and how much intensity in the differential relation between matter and energy is needed for a transformation to happen? As such, for Simondon, information becomes literally synonymous with significance. Information for Simondon is synonymous with meaning. Synonymous with meaning. Nothing is informational or meaningful out of birthright, nor does anyone get to find meaning in the same way, get to be informed in the same way. So what matters is neither the emitter nor the message, but a particular state of a perceiving system, the receiving system, that needs to be metastable enough in order to become informed. A metastable system is traversed by potentials and powers, by energy gradients and tendencies, so that at any moment, the most minute and imperceptible imbalance, the most fleeting encounter, can be enough to put things into motion and lead to systemic transformation. So as Simondon says, information is never relative to a single and homogeneous reality, but relative to two orders in a state of disparation, in a state of tension. Information is never deposited in a form that is able to be given. It is the signification, the production of meaning, that will emerge when an operation of individuation will discover the dimension according to which two disparate reals, two reals in tension, can become one, can come together and make one system. For that reason, Simondon asks us to replace the notion of form with that of information, and to suppose the existence of a system in metastable equilibrium that can have the energetic potential to go further in its individuation. So systems that are governed by linear causality, systems that are full of comfortable and familiar alephic necessities, are ultra-stable, and therefore they cannot evolve. They simply succumb, they fall victims to entropy itself. On the contrary, stubborn systems, those stubborn systems that Ananke has blessed, are metastable, and because of that, they're full of information. They are no longer supposedly pregnant with simple geometrical forms and shapes, those that all of us architects are familiar with, but they're pregnant with significative, meaningful forms that establish a transformative order within a system but therefore later can have the capacity to transform both itself but also the world. In a system of stable equilibrium, in other words, the tiles match the floor perfectly and therefore make it fully homogeneous. This is an exhausted and exhausting homogeneity where no activity is present because no activity is needed. We have matched the floors with the tiles, that's it, we can get done. For that reason, Simondon will claim that evolution has nothing to do with perfection. It's not about attaining a perfect state. Evolution as perfection for Simondon is just a fancy word for absolute homogeneity, and therefore for the death of a system. For Simondon, on the contrary, evolution is an informational integration, the maintaining of a metastability that settles more and more upon itself, and in doing so continuously accumulates potentials for more structural and operational changes. So to counter death, to fight the inevitable, Simondon suggests that from the apeiron before individuation to the apeiron after life, from the undetermined of the before to the undetermined of the after, from the first dust to the last, an operation is carried out that does not break down into dust. Life is in its present, in its resolution, and not in its remainder. So life in its negentropic activity, in its present, that is informationally meaningful, it does so because it continuously demands yet another attempt in tiling the cosmic floor. Life is never satisfied with one given way that the floor is tiled. However, we are once again for a surprise. Why? Because something is meaningful only when it's constrained. As biologist Stuart Kauffman wrote it, constraints are information, and information is constrained. One of architecture's greatest lessons is that in order to enhance life, in order to make it meaningful, you need to constrain it negentropically. So, from gathering around a fire in the middle of the night to actually erecting skyscrapers or rearranging our furniture in the living room, architecture is always a process of cohomological floor tiling. In the architectural coupling of existing constraints, new constraints are introduced, but they get to be informative, get to be meaningful, by actually reducing our options, so from an infinity of options to an infinity at least minus one, and ironically, in reducing our options, they enhance our affective capacities. They enhance what we can do. In architecture, constraints are acting for truly what they are. In architecture, as one of the most prime examples, constraints are acting as synapses. As hinted earlier, one way to understand non-alephic necessities is norms and values. So as established patterns of action and desired outcomes of action. So for Simondon, the very act itself is producing and continuously produced by norms and values. As he claims, values, so why this furniture there, why that furniture there, why skyscraper, why a low house, why next to the fire, why far away from the fire. These all are a discussion on values. There's nothing necessary about them. Values are that through which the norms of a system can become the norms of another system through a change of structures. Values establish and make possible the transductivity of norms, not as a permanent alephic necessity, as a permanent norm that is nobler than any other, for it would be quite difficult to discover a norm that was already truly given, but as a meaning of the axiomatic of becoming that is conserved from one state, metastable state, to the next. So close to what Patricia Reed was saying before, against the naturalization of alephic necessities, Simondon also examines individuation only on the principle of individuation, on the principle of activity itself, developing an ontogenetic account of the acts, norms, and values that make it go further. To do so, he clarifies that norms and values do not exist prior to the system of being in which they appear. They are becoming, instead of appearing in becoming, without being part of it. There is a historicity on the emergence of values, why this furniture there, why that furniture here, just as there is a historicity in the constitution of norms. You have to always put that furniture there. Ethics cannot be recreated based on norms or based on values, no more than the being can be recreated based on the forms and matters to which an analysis reduces the conditions of ontogenesis. Ethics is the requirement according to which there is a significative correlation of norms and values. To grasp ethics in their unity requires that one accompany ontogenesis. Ethics is the meaning of individuation, the meaning of a synergy of successive individuations. So in the coming together of norms and values, in this coming together, any technicity actually generates a sheer affective power. Any technicity, when norms and values are coming together, can actually produce potestas and potentia. I will very briefly explain what that means. Potentia, according originally to Spinoza, but also in the way that Simondon reworked it, potentia is operational and pre-individual power, while potestas is structural and actualized power. Potestas is what do I have in my possession. Potentia is what can I do with what I have. Structural power, potestas, organizes operational power by structuring it. However, potentia is the engendering determination of what already exists as structure, as potentia. So in power, there is always a relation of co-determination between what you have and what you can do. Simondon takes exactly this co-determination, what I have, what I can do, and implies that it's the basis of a similar way of reading norms and values as well. So similar to the way that the potentials inform the potestas and vice versa, similar to that way, norms and values also possess no moral degrees. There's no one that says that this comes first as a norm or this comes first as a value. This move will allow Simondon to claim that even if there was an analytic moral uber constraint, then it would be neither in the norms nor in the values alone, but in their differential relation, in the way that they exchange intensities with one another. So in this informational account of non-alephic necessities, Simondon will highlight what I hinted earlier, the importance of a term that he coins as autonormativity. To explain what autonormativity means, Simondon uses the example of a hiker lost in a forest, like the one you can see in this picture. So each step that a hiker takes when walking into the woods is its own consequence. It is self-constitutive. The act of walking into the wood does not include any intrinsic directionality, any form of a sort of inherent compass that will orient the hiker. And likewise, if a hiker gets lost, it's not possible to depend on any familial or recognizable exterior form. It's a very dense woody forest after all. So in other words, for a hiker in the woods, there are no norms, no set rule of directions, because every step in every direction is equiprobable and equivalent at once. So from an infinity of directions, there is an infinity of where we could possibly go in that deep forest. The first step, as the act of hiking in the forest, becomes the norm itself. Every step that follows builds on the relation of a step before, one after the other, leading the hiker eventually to the edge of the forest. That's what autonormativity is, this building of activity upon itself that eventually produces norms and values. So the norm is derived from the act. Every act has no law in its beginning, but valorizes itself in an autogenous fashion because it continues and rests consequently more and more on itself. Therefore, the norms and values of any technicity, including the architectural ones that dictate us how to tile the cosmic floor, are not just co-determinable, but they're fundamentally contingent. What is crucial, however, is how the act itself will allow for a passage of a mnemic theme, a memory of the future, Masumi would say, that would fold the constraints upon constraints in a way that would eventually produce new necessities, new norms and values, that in their informational intensity, they would eventually demand at a point a new rearrangement of the cosmos. As we said before, life never is satisfied with one way of arranging things. Therefore, the act of any technicity in this eventuating power that it has becomes the very a presenti, that's another Simondonian term, the very a presenti principle of individuation. There's no a posteriori, no a priori. It's the a presenti of individuating activity. This memory of the future, this mnemic theme that synaptically constrains and crosses, is actually a virtual, if we use the Deleuzian term, a virtual theme of potentials a virtual theme of operational power. What becomes very important, therefore, is the act of the step itself. The moment where the cosmos is still undecided as to what it is and what it will become. The moment where Ananke closes her eyes for a second, undecided as to what move her hands will do next. If every step in the dark cosmic forest is equiprobable and equivalent at once, it's precisely because it is equipotential. It's not yet what it will become when it's put into full circuit with a virtual potential theme, with the rhythms of the technicities in the upper zenti over the inventive capacities. What is at stake, nonetheless, is the question, and that's the last part of the talk, I'm finishing. What is at stake is the question of how to be placed in contact with this virtual theme and all its productive contingencies. How can we approach, in other words, the synaptic passages of this cosmic futural memory and out of them intuit lines of individuation that are not in front of us yet, that may only be catalyzed later? Simondon will claim that what one perceives when perceiving is neither outlines nor shapes, but actually thresholds of intensity, pointing out, according to him, that sensation is simultaneously intensive and differential. Sensation, and that's Simondon saying so, is the grasping of a direction, not of an object. I can repeat that one again because it's important, or at least I find it very important also as an architect. Sensation is not the grasping of an object. Sensation is the grasping of a direction. So the question remains, how can we examine the sensation of a direction that does not address the present, but rather that which is yet to come? And again, I repeat, I think that's what architects do all the time, or designers in broader ways. They try to grasp a sensation of that what's yet to come, that what's not in front of us in time and space yet. To do so, continuing this line of thinking I've developed, I can claim that we can approach this effort as an issue of synapses. A synapse is a constraint, is a junction, an almost imperceptible gap through which an impulse of intensity passes by. Beyond the temptations we might have to put it in space and time, the synaptic moment and the synaptic location are nothing but pure action and experience, and therefore pure relationality. Both a material object and a figure of thought. The complementarity of an actual brain that perceives and a virtual mind that can only feel what comes. As such, synapses manage to capture both the passage of an intensity as a synaptic moment and the formation of an extensity as the synaptic location, where two things touch one another. We could call them, as Masumi has done, as electric thought. That's what synapses are, electric thought. We can also speak about them as Félix Guattari had, and start claiming that A-signifying synapses, which are simultaneously irreversibilizing, singularizing, heterogenizing, and necessitating, pushing us from the world of memories of redundancies embedded in extrinsic coordinates into universes of pure intensive iterations, which have no memory, discursive memory, since their very existence acts as such. In other words, synapses can be understood as a constraint. They delimit the field of the possible while reinforcing the field of the potential. To understand that, we can also follow a bit more Guattari in the way that he connects synapses with speed. He claims, Guattari, that synapses don't only bring together the chronic as the time of our own lived experience, but also bring together the aeonic as the time of pre-individual potentials. And in doing so, formulating a bridge that connects molar extensities, bodies and shapes, with molecular intensities, figures of thought, universes of pure intensive iteration, as he calls there. It's therefore a matter of a disparate relation between the finite speed of the fixed, the molar, and the infinite speed of the intensive, the molecular, and how through a synapse the two are brought and bound together. Or, again, to use the original Latin term, how the two of them are constrained. As such, synapses are essentially constraints that act as intensity regulators. They determine how much, how fast, and how intense a play of limits can be sustained before crossing a threshold that would eventually demand a new relation, a new rearranging of the cosmic tiles. So having in our mind the previous definition of information, a difference that can make a difference, synapses can literally be understood as informational constraints. As Simondon claims, the regime of information is what defines the degree of individuality. In order to appreciate it, we must establish a relation between the propagation speed of information and the duration of the act or event to which information is relative. So in the synaptic location, the speed of information is determined, while in the synaptic moment, the duration of its passage is regulated. In the relation between the two, any technicity is precisely catalyzing those two elements, synaptic moments and location, and therefore turns architecture into something much more significant and important than simply constructing and arranging things in space. Architecture becomes a synapse in its own right. It allows both to formulate and create an extensive space that can be lived, experienced, destroyed, praised, condemned, you name it, but also it allows for the very possibility of intuiting a space yet to come, and consequently, a subject yet to individuate, precisely because architectural technicities allow for this degree of indeterminacy. As Simondon says, the true progressive perfecting of machines, of architecture, I would like to say, whereby we could say a machine's degree of technicity is raised, corresponds not to an increase of automatism, but on the contrary, to the fact that the operation of a machine harbors a certain margin of indeterminacy. It's this margin that allows the machine to be sensitive to outside information. So therefore, architecture transforms information into forms by allowing its technicities to effectively open up to the indeterminacy of a differential influx. This influx of differences is nothing but an influx of intensities. It's the gathering of memorial traits of previous existences. Within architectural technicities, one can locate a dynamism, especially regarding the capacity of architecture to invent anything new. This dynamism entails the reticular synaptic relation between an actual architectural technicity, one that happens right here, right now, and a virtual potential architectural product, between the limited number of the cosmic tiles, for which we have established a technicity, and the unlimited ways of placing them next to each other, between the way that an Anguis fiddles and between the way that her hands move seductively. So to paraphrase Simondon, for an architect to invent is to make one's thought function as architecture might function, not according to causality, which is too fragmentary and linear, but according to the dynamism of lived functioning, grasped because it's produced, accompanied in its very genesis. I'm almost done. On the basis of this lived functioning, Simondon defines invention. For him, invention will appear as the discovery of a way to restore the continuity of action. So let's take two simple examples. That's what you can see in this picture. An organist that needs to both play.
Oké, hij is nog steeds bezig. Oké, ik geef hem aan jou.
Sorry. An organist.
Kan je daar een stondje zetten?
Ja.
Zullen we daar een koffietje doen?
Sorry, someone needs to be muted. Yeah. So again, invention. For Simondon, invention appears as the discovery of a way to restore the continuity of action. And there is two examples, very simple examples that Simondon gives to us. An organist, let's say a piano player, that needs to both play the piano and turn the pages of his partiture, and a rockfall that blocks one's journey. The first, the piano player needing to turn the pages, entails an intrinsic incompatibility, and the later, the rock in our path, entails an extrinsic incompatibility. In both cases, this incompatibility is resolved by the invention of a technicity that acts as a synapse in constraining formally distinct sets of actions and bringing them together into a novel continuous dimension. So finger technique, which basically is an elaborate technique of playing the piano and also being able to move the partiture, and a hydraulic winch, which we would have to pull down in order for a rock to be pushed without using our hands. Both of them are expressions of a synaptic passage that introduces a novel constraint which provokes a qualitative change in an operative system, restoring the compatibility between sensory motor subsets of action, as well as between action and the environment. As Simondon says, solutions, so finger technique, hydraulic winches, solutions shows up as restorations of continuity of action, enabling the progressiveness of operative modes along paths previously invisible within the structure of a given reality. Invention is the emergence of an extrinsic compatibility between the environment and the organism, and of an intrinsic compatibility between the subsets of action. I was walking, I cannot walk anymore. How can I make these two compatible? I was playing, I don't need to stop in order to change the page. I need to have a compatibility that continues the action. Detours, the fabrication of instruments, and the association of several operators all represent different means of re-establishing intrinsic and extrinsic compatibilities. In this schism between lines of action, a potential and pre-individual pool of potentials is expressed, making invention a matter of degree of openness, of how sensitive one can be to them. After all, what does that schism consist of but just a disparation between norms and values that invention attempts to resolve? In the moment that an established action, a norm, encounters an obstacle, in our case a rock here, that it disrupts its dynamic continuity, then the invention of a desire, I want to go ahead in my path, forces us to invent something such as a hydraulic winch that will unblock the path for us. So as a matter of fact, more than a wish, it's an issue of a demanding necessity, the Spinozian conatus of restoring the active encantlement of the cosmic fibers and furthering individuation according to its own individuating potentials. This is where Ananke reigns in full force. So therefore, one needs to be effectively sensitive to the indeterminacy that any discontinuity of action implies, since there is simply never one and only solution. There is never one and only way to turn the partiture while playing the piano. There is never one and only way to unblock a path. There is never one and only way to constrain action back into its dynamic and differential flow. To be sensitive to indeterminacy means, first of all, to be able to localize it. And Simondon is explicit about it. To receive information and therefore be susceptible to change, we need to be able to localize its indeterminacy. And again, this is where synapses are crucial, not only because they allow for a memory of the past to pass through, how things were done already, but also because it catalyzes their transduction, the exchange of the intensive with the intensive, of a synapse with another synapse. Synapses belong neither to the domain of potential energy nor to the domain of actual energy. They are the true mediator between these two domains, but is neither a domain of accumulation of energy nor a domain of their actualization. It's a margin of indeterminacy between these two domains, that which brings potential energy to its action. It's during the course of this passage from potential to actual that information comes into play. Information itself is this condition of actualization. So following Ananke in her indeterminately moves of her world, the future is allowed to inform the present as a virtual affair of states is informing an actual state of affairs. Through these synaptic constraints, the certainty of the one is exchanged for the uncertainty of the other, without assigning any primacy to any of the two. So now we come full cycle in the very last words I'll say. We come full cycle and we can think of our dying star again, the sun. If you recall, I put a question mark when I was calling the inevitable question mark heat death of the sun. Is it true that the sun has an inevitable heat death? Is it truly inevitable? If we follow what I was explaining so far, and if we follow Ananke, then we might start hesitating to respond. Our best answer would be that the death of the sun is almost inevitable. It's this almost certainty that in it lies the very reason and motivation of making it yet another day, of constraining the cosmic fibers differently, of intensifying the synaptic passages of a potential virtual memory in a different way, of always being one technicity away. After all, every day we rotate around this dying star with the help of small, actual synapses, almost insignificant to the eye. That's what Andrej mentioned closing his previous talk just now on Stiegler. Bizarre as it sounds, of literally anything else we know in the universe, from our sun to an airplane, and from our brains to our cars, a computer chip is the thing, the synapse, that can conduct the most energy flowing through a gram of matter per second. Is some million times more than the sun. The narrower the synaptic passage, the denser the folds between constraints, the greater the differential between matter and energy, and consequently, the more potential for a difference to make an informational difference, for the world to informationally rearrange itself. So if we trust our goddess, if we trust Ananke, then we can only keep on moving forward our steps, one after the other, autonormatively building upon themselves in the cosmic forest. In other words, there can never be a certain past and an uncertain future, or the other way around, but rather a continuous and constant synaptic exchange between indeterminate constraints that belong only to the present of activity. The memory of that ongoing activity is cutting always both ways. It plunges towards the past and it questions any norm. That's why we change norms all the time. Simultaneously, it takes a leap into the future and it enunciates, it allows for the emergence of values that will literally change the cosmos and ourselves. And thankfully, and that's my last sentence, how we bring these norms and values, established and expected together, will always be open up to us, escaping any alephic burden besides the very truth of our continuous negentropic determination. Thank you. That's it.
Wow, wow. What a feast. Thank you, Stavros. Thank you, Andrej. That was a lot to think about. I want maybe I can kick off these questions. We kind of maybe invite those on watching on YouTube and indeed those our Zoom audience here to also come up with some kind of questions. But I've actually got two questions. I'll just ask one and keep the other for later on if there's time. Maybe you can refer to it. But I guess I was just thinking as you were talking just now, Stavros, about synapses and seeing synapses as constraints. Well, the way, of course, in the world of AI, they loosely model neural networks on the neural networks of the brain.
Right.
In that discourse, the synapses are actually controlled by weights. The flow of information is controlled by weights. The synapses themselves are not blocking or constraining anything. It's the weights. And what happens, what tends to happen, and it is a concept that's been put forward by Geoffrey Hinton, is we can use a process of what's called back propagation, of readjusting the weights in order to get closer to the target. And in some senses, that works also in terms of the neuroscientific world. I'm thinking here particularly of the work of Anil Seth, who has this understanding that our perception of reality is a form of controlled hallucination. And that control comes from reining in these predictive perceptions that we have about the world and getting close to reality. So in both cases, there is a form of adaptation that is implicit in the model, or it's not the role of the synapses itself. But anyway, this question of adaptation is something that I just want to just interrogate a little bit further, because I appreciate that in Stiegler's work there are some accommodations for, the whole notion of co-evolution of individuation, and the concept of time seems to be written into this in a certain way. Although I still have a nervousness there is a form of technological determinism at the heart of Stiegler's approach. But anyway, what I wanted to say is that I'm interested by this kind of the way that we kind of adapt to technology. And I guess I was taught, this is back in the 80s in Cambridge, in a tradition of a kind of Heidegger-inspired tradition, which in some ways was a reaction against the kind of the celebration of technology that had been going on in the 60s and 70s. The kind of archigram, high tech, whatever it is, ... that was going on in the UK. And there's a resistance to that. I get Doctor Who, also James Bond, they're all kind of technological sort of figures. They were celebrating things. And there was this resistance to it. And we were reading Heidegger, and we were banned from using computers. That was Delabor's line, Delabor's line, you were banned from using computers. But at the same time, there was something really odd that was happening in that I had one of my colleagues was someone called Gabriela Heusler, who was doing a PhD under Dalibor. Her husband was a jumbo jet pilot, 747 pilot. And Dalibor, despite his resistance to technology, and he was himself trained as an engineer, was his jaw dropped whenever this guy was talking about his jumbo jets. What I want to get towards is something that I think is really kind of interesting, because I sense the presence of not only Heidegger here, but also to some extent two other French intellectuals, to some extent, well, I think clearly Virilio, especially on the question about speed and time, is there, no question. And I also sense the presence of Baudrillard in some way, and what I find is very interesting about Baudrillard and Virilio, and maybe it also applies to Heidegger, I don't know, but it's the way in which they approach certain things, and which somehow all is not what it seems, because despite the virulent critiques they offer, often of technology, you cannot help sense a kind of form of repressed fascination about that which they're attacking. And when I was first invited to write about Virilio for a book that came out, Andrej Armitage's book, I read Virilio in what I was told was the wrong way. I read him as being someone who was absolutely enthralled by technology, rather than critiquing it. And then Doina Petrescu, who had been studying under Derrida and Sixo at the time in Paris, said, no, Virilio, he hates technology. He hates it. But the same happens actually with Baudrillard, especially on the question about the image. There is this powerful critique of the image, and his discourse of aestheticization, his notion of hyper-reality as the dominant positions, world of images that we're lost in. We're marooned in this kind of world of images without actually engaging with the world. But this powerful critique begins to unfold. I mean, I went to an exhibition that he had of his photographs. Now, what was this? Here was the person, the biggest critic of images, having an exhibition of photographs. And so what I find in this work is the kind of a logic of repressed fascination that is mounted, and often maybe I'm wrong here, but often that repressed fascination begins to, I mean, that undermines that position at some point. Eventually, we do accept the technology. Eventually, we do. I recall when I was a student, everyone being horrified by the comment by Le Corbusier that the house is a machine to live in. It was, how could a home be a machine to live in? And yet, gradually over time, our houses have become that, especially our kitchens, highly technological environments, and it's kind of crept in. So and I understand that you could possibly take Stiegler's work and begin to understand this kind of process of this interface between time and technology, and how this maybe the resistance might begin to wane and collapse, maybe in a kind of process of becoming in some senses. But what I'm interested in is this initial stance that, as I say, to my mind, it's a slightly technological deterministic one, essentially essentializing one against technology. And I wonder to what extent it could be accused of a kind of repressed fascination, that maybe it's not as watertight or as fully convincing as it's posited, and underneath there is something that undermines it. And it's a difficult concept to think about. It's kind of very Freudian in some senses, but I nonetheless find whenever I come across these very stringent critiques, these very powerful polemical critiques, that occasionally they're undermined by their own rhetoric. Is that fair to say? And do you see any evidence in Stiegler of that kind of discourse?
Andrej, you're going to go ahead first?
Yes, to give you a time to catch a breath. I think it seems to me that what Stavros was describing and deliberately driving into the idea of technicity is to avoid, I think technicity is not to be conflated with technology. Technicity is, in the way that he was describing the givenness of the constant of the first law and the indeterminacy of the second law of thermodynamics, is literally any and every way of it's a great mannerism of how is it that we do things, so technicity would certainly encompass technology, but not necessarily, doesn't need to be reduced to it. And here I think Stiegler is, and I've heard him, talking about another disciple of his, contemporary philosopher Yuk Hui, who should be perhaps mentioned here, about this idea that that if we agree that it would be necessary to maintain and sustain and promote biodiversity, that for us to continue to experiment in terms of constraints eventually would call for a very similar attitude vis-a-vis technodiversity. So I think Stiegler would play that card, would say that yes, technology, but we cannot limit it. We have to continue to experiment so that technodiversity may engender new diversity, the diversity of minds. So that would be what I was trying to develop with the reference of going against platitudes. And I think in some way what Stavros was describing, drawing on Simon Don, which probably is the most important predecessor of Stiegler's, is this idea of autonormativity, because I think the fourth volume of Technics and Time, as I said, with the subtitle of Post-Truth, it's exactly that. It's about the truth, not in terms of correspondence with with anything. It's about the individual. How is it that things individuate, including the values and norms that cannot be taken for granted?
To add to that, I mean, just to bring one more Stieglerian, because I did mention barely 1 or 2 times Stiegler's name in the lecture, and that was on purpose. But to connect it with Stiegler's discourse, and also with all the things that Andrej was mentioning in his own, let's say, almost complete overview of Stiegler's thought. And it's also an attempt to respond to what you were asking, Neil. So one of the latest concerns of Stiegler, perhaps the one that might have made him quite, let's call it subtly melancholic about stuff, and he was writing about, he was lecturing about it in the last book, the one on the Nanjing lectures. It was this question of the neganthropocene, which again, I mean, he liked to use very pompous terms, Stiegler, but it's something relatively simple. The neganthropocene is basically saying that whatever we do to our planet, okay, to the world we're living in its own right is a question of value. It can't be done otherwise, and therefore we should start thinking, could we perhaps do some things otherwise in order to both sustain ourselves existing, but also, again, I'm simplifying, the environment existing. To give you an example on this notion of autonormativity, on this, let's say, fundamental indeterminacy and openness of norms and values, including technological norms and values. A pig, and Andrej, we use that example in some of the lectures we give together. A pig that we raise and we feed for 1 year and then we slaughter in the end is literally, operationally speaking, they don't look alike, but operationally speaking is exactly the same as a fridge.
Refrigerator.
A fridge. We put nutrition in it that gets to be stored for a long period of time, which we can use at will later on when needed, okay? A pig and a fridge are literally, operationally speaking, the same. However, they both have, I'm not going to say radically, but they both have a very different effect, a very different impact, negentropically, let's say, and entropically. The energy that they demand and the energy that they give back to the world are very different from one another. This is essentially a question of value. How we differentiate between a pig, raising a pig and slaughtering it after a year, and a refrigerator is a question of value. And therefore, there's not one single response to it that would say that this is the good way or that's the bad way. If therefore everything is so indeterminately open, how could we address those issues without falling apart? Without literally falling apart in an almost postmodernist, let's say, attitude, which would say, everything goes then. How can we avoid that? How can we evaluate value? Again, for me, that was the last, perhaps the most important even question that Stiegler brought forth. How can we evaluate value? And I think it's a question it's never going to stop being relevant, never will receive a fixed response to. The same way that between a pig and a fridge, there's no fixed response as to what's better.
Yeah, I guess. Well, I think my real concern was that very initial stage of position taking, where the basis of any polemic is always potentially undone by the logic of repression. That we tend to, in order to make a polemic, we leave out often the dialectical balancing act. But anyway, let's not get too caught in that. I want to open this up to the discussion among the Zoom audience. I'm particularly pleased to see we have Zygam here today, who is also a Stiegler scholar, coming more from the world of art and philosophy. We also have Mikhail here, and I want to just basically just open it up to some questions and to get others involved. I don't know, Zygam. I assume you are you able to unmute yourself if you want to ask a question? Okay, and I'd also invite you, Zyga. Okay, let's go ahead.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me first, and very nice to see you, Neil. Hello, my great thanks to both speakers today, Andrej and Stavros. Thank you very much for keeping this very important radical philosophical work brought by a great person and great philosopher Stiegler in this very turbulent times when essentialism, militarism, nationalism is growing, unfortunately, against which I guess before everything, Stiegler stood before everything. And of course, his main occupation in philosophy was noesis, thought. And in this, saying that, what is the basic idea is we are all faulty beings, faultiness of subjects. That's a very important thing, because this faultiness itself is a condition of going on doing things, not necessarily completely becoming perfect, but actually being able to do anything at all. I would say like this. And from here, I just wanted to, first of all, to say to Neil that I disagree that Stiegler is technologically deterministic. Not quite. On the contrary, he sees in technologies possibility of people realizing constantly where our not being perfect and constantly learning skills of surfing, basically, like we do on the internet. And of course, that's a very important thing that we can take from his own work. For example, in volume 2 of Technics and Time on cinema, he talks about this sort of very interesting idea, dérouchage. Dérouchage is in editing, film editing, is rushes of film, you know, things which we throw away as unwanted, just to make perfect film, you know. But these rushes themselves contain something very important. So, and Stiegler calls for rearranging things according to those things that are actually excluded from our experience. So I think that is the message coming from Stiegler today to all of the things which I addressed before is beautifully expressed in your work, architectural work, which I'm very fascinated with. And what Stavros was explaining the tile, Leibniz's notion of it is extremely interesting. As an artist, I find it very, very interesting also. Thank you very much. Sorry, just wanted to say that because there are lots of other people wants to say. Thank you very much.
That's very kind of you. Thank you so much. I agree with you. I also don't take Stiegler to be in any case, techno-determinist. It seems to me that what he was trying to do is to claim the right position for techne in general, because previously, I mean, in the long history of Western thought, techne is seen as less. Episteme was sort of brought up as the thing, as something, and techne was considered to be of a minor, an underdog, so to speak. And he wants to bring it back to the and say there's no techne without episteme, and noesis it has to be produced in the way that we're trying to argue for. It is teased out and not to be found. Thank you so much, for your kind comments.
not to hit up the discussion, but there is one point that Stiegler was I'm not going to say wrong, because who is wrong and right, but there is one point that is a bit problematic in the bad sense of the term with Stiegler, and that has to do with the notion of prosthesis. And some of the misunderstandings with Stiegler come from there, I would say. It's strangely, I think that he would eventually end up disagreeing also with himself were he to revisit the term prosthetics, because it kind of goes contrary to many or most of his other, especially his later ambitions. As a starting point, I mean, fundamentally, to what I described today, prosthetics has no place in there. Because if we think of a human as faulty, you mentioned the faultiness. If we think of a human as faulty, then we simultaneously assume that there is an archetypical version of a human that we are lacking of. On a line of thought that perhaps is even more Stiglerian than what Stiegler would do for himself, we can actually go the other way around, the opposite way, and consider the human as not faulty, but as excessive. We are in continuous excess of our activity, of what we can do, of what is being done on us. The more we do stuff, the more stuff relate with one another. The more they relate with one another, the more new constraints are introduced. The more new are introduced, the more new potentials are opened. So I would say if we stick into that line where nothing is fixed in advance, we would have some problems in understanding the human as faulty. It's a matter of a change of attitude, but I think it might also have something.
I just want to mention that, you know, if you start from the prosthesis, you might be accused of joining the camp of what is it called, transhumanism, kind of enhancement. And I think Deleuze and Guattari are pretty, right in avoiding the prosthesis and replacing it with the idea of an assemblage, because it doesn't predetermine what might yet happen. So you don't. In this way, they ward off the possibility of turning it into an anthropocentric position where you start from the subject and then enhance its capacities and powers. So whatever happens, the way we were describing it has to stem out of the assemblage that doesn't privilege any term of the relation itself.
Just interesting, actually, that the comment about the suspicion that there is nonetheless, despite everything that Stiegler says, there is a little hint of technological determinism. It's not mine; it's someone else's. And I think that the critique is that because technology becomes so foundational, there's a sense in which it becomes slightly autonomous. But I would just simply kind of like I like to be provocative and to ask questions like that. We have Mikhail has got a question. So let's Mikhail, of course, has been collaborating with you guys in Delft. Maybe I could invite Mikhail to ask his question.
Yes, sure. Neil, can you hear me all?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Stavros and Andrej, for another fabulous session, and good to see you. I made tons of notes and look forward to going through this again. Well, I would have many questions, but let me just bring up one thing if I can get this together. I'm just basically winging this off the top of my head right now, and let's see what you think. So I have recently worked on let's say notions of Platonic spaces in a more process-based and immanent sense. For instance, they're quite prominent now in the work of the biologist Mike Levin. For instance, in synthetic organisms, we see behavior that cannot be explained by evolution or, let's say, selection alone. And it may be that the idea would be that evolution or biology seem to exploit potentials that are beyond physicalism, the triangles and so on and so forth, in a very simple sense, but perhaps up to potentially minds. So in Whitehead, there is also, right, this notion of pure potentials that, as he actually, I think Whitehead puts it, sort of yearning for actualization. So maybe the interesting, I think, point of view for me here is that it's an inversion of desire in a sense. Like in a way, it's like the agency of the pattern in a sense, or of the virtual yearning to be actualized.
Mhm.
And actually, I think Stavros has just basically brought up what I was going to refer to. And this also goes back to your wonderful session on Stiegler back in 2021 in memory of Stiegler.
Mhm.
And I think Stavros, you said it there as well, right? That the problem of the primordial lack, or this Derridian notion of the primordial lack, and now it's just been come up as like the faultiness or the incomplete. Well, incompleteness might be good actually, but more like the prosthesis in a sense. I think maybe incompleteness could be one perspective, but. So, okay, I'm not sure this is actually a question, but more so like an idea or something unfinished on my part. So I'm interested in this, the dynamic between I suppose, as I said, the agency of the virtual, and how might we actually regard, it could be the human, or I think it goes far beyond the human actually, from this perspective of incompleteness. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
You want to go, Andrej, first, or?
You go.
I'm going to say things you shared already, even very recently, Andrej, so it's okay. I apologize to you for being boring, perhaps, but I want to also say this next example, while also trying to respond a bit to the initial comment that Neil made about synapses and constraints. In that book, that both me and Andrej picked this last comment about the computer chips being the most, synaptically speaking, the most potent, at least to our knowledge, let's say, element in the whole known universe, in the sense of how much energy crosses through these very small, let's say, pinball of matter. In that same book by Kevin Kelly, which is called What Technology Wants, which is a very light book to read. It's almost pop reading in a way. You can do it at bedtime before sleep. He's giving another wonderful example that in a way, to me, it addresses both synapses and constraints, but also a discussion on completeness and incompleteness, on faultiness. He's basically laying through a series of examples in there. He's laying out a connection, that it's a fact almost, between the shape and size and dimensions of the rockets that the beloved Elon Musk, for example, is sending to outer space now. So the rockets that we're using to travel into space, and surprisingly, the dimension of the periphery, let's say, of the butt literally, the butt, B-U-T-T, the butt of a horse, in the way that the roads where horses were carrying carriages were laid out initially in the Roman Empire. So in the Roman Empire, laying out roads carried by two horses next to one another, certain dimensions were specified for how wide a street could have been, a road could have been, which later on specified further, constrained and brought together synaptically the dimensions of more modern versions of roads, which later on constrained the construction of tunnels through mountains as railroads were being opened up, which later on, for these space rocket parts to be assembled together in various factories in the States, were also in need to respect those dimensions of the two horses in their butt periphery next to one another. So there is a lineage in there of continuous constraints and synapses between Roman empires, roads, butts, tunnels, space parts, eventually leading up determining the dimensions that a modern space rocket has. This is, for me, as good it can get, example of autonormativity, of norms and values that build upon themselves, of us in our technicities, human technology environment as one, being totally not faulty. I mean, we are not lacking the perfect shape of space rockets, and we are still lacking it perhaps, and we are in pursuit. It's continuously being produced. And as a third consequence, highlighting once again the discussion on value. This discussion on value, which is eventually a discussion, it's primordial in its own right, it's a discussion that comes from peers, Chan's Peirce, let's say. Why this rather than that? This is the most important question, according to Peirce, in our known and unknown universe. It's not nothing out of something or the other way around. It's why this rather than that. Why certain choices were made, why certain choices were not made, why things look like this, why things don't look like that. Precisely on that question of value, I also think, and I can pass it on to Andrej, it's where Stiegler's inspiration from Simondon, the term alienation, eventually turning it into proletarianization, that's precisely where it comes from. If we are unable to determine in our own ways this discussion on value, on the why this rather than that, we are fundamentally losing touch with the very production of our world. And losing touch with the very production of our world, pragmatically, has exactly that same consequence. We have no connection to the production of the world which we happen to be in. We are becoming proletariats in the sense that I could swear, but I'm not going to swear. We have no idea what's going on.
I will piggyback on this example to follow it with another example, which I think underscores that, but also takes it to again back to the topic of synapses. Is again indisputable now that the consequence of the moment that humans have become bipedal creatures, in order for them to navigate space with a certain level of ease, the body plan needed to readjust so that the hips would come closer together so that people could walk. This, as a consequence, created an awkward condition that the birth canal was now coming to the point, because of the hips coming together, to the point where we couldn't wait for the infant to be fully mature at the point of birth. So that turned the human babies into unique species, life forms that are born prematurely. Because they are not fully developed, but it had to be negotiated in the space of possibilities. This, in turn, had a consequence, unintended consequence, that from the get-go, a baby was completely fully dependent on its environment, including their extended family, which meant that the contribution of the environment to its development was disproportionately big. It is interesting that Printer for a long time has been asking this question in one of his essays called the "Are You Experienced?" He said he draws on a piece of information reference that in every second up to 6 months, a baby would develop 100,000 synaptic connections per second. In the latest iteration of this essay, he revised it, and now he claims that it's 1 million neural connections per second. So the baby's brain literally thrives on information, and this is all to say that this cascading of different events produce something that at first sight would look like a great disadvantage, because like a prematurely born baby, completely that can't defend itself. If you monitor the birth of any other animal, they are immediately kind of ready to run around and go and so on. It eventually turned out to be the greatest advantage because of the extended kind of post-birth development in this kind of intensive way, where we have the sculpturing of the brain becomes really fully contingent upon the surroundings and the environment itself. And I think in that sense, and also, to directly answer to your question, we know for a fact, I mean, we see this in, and I think Elizabeth Gross was the one who was in her work touching on this. Nature is not operating in the basis of optimization and efficiency. It's gregarious. It produces more than Deleuze and Guattari have this almost quasi-religious way of saying it. The things, expressions or actualizations sing the glory of God. I mean, the potential is so big that it produces something that is not necessarily in terms of like function in a very reductionist, limited way of seeing things. It's gregarious. It's the positive in cybernetic terms. It's a positive feedback that just produces more of itself. There is something about this.
In the spirit of gregariousness, because there is a question in the chat by Ashik, I think, yeah, where basically it finishes by saying, in the context of architecture, how the design process can reclaim care in a world that's driven by efficiency, speed, and economic constraints. And Andrej pointed out to that, and I think it's important to address it. Andrej also said that it could be addressed in the discussion. Responding to that question of care. Hello, Ashik. Hi. Responding to that question of care, I mean, Andrej pointed before that perhaps a response could be going against the dictum of minimum effort, maximum efficiency. How could we go again to that dictum? By reversing it around, by proposing a maximum effort and a minimum result, a minimum efficiency. For me, and then Andrej can continue if he wants. For me, the one term that captures perfectly the ethos of a maximum effort, minimum result is playing. But when I say playing, games, playing. When I say playing, I don't mean it to be constrained and to be associated purely with what we colloquially understand as playing or as games. I can very provocatively claim that everything that has been ever designed and invented is a result of playing, is a result of playfulness. Okay, this is an example. For example, this is an example I take from one PhD colleague of ours, Yasin, that he works on that issue, of playfulness. Where he's claiming, Yasin, that, for example, ice skating, in its own right, ice skating is a technicity. It has many technologically invented objects in there. There's nothing faulty in it. We were not faulty, and we were not lacking ice skating when we were born out of our mothers, or when we started as diverse civilizations around the world. There was no lack in ice skating. We produced ice skating. How did we produce ice skating? By playful what-ifs that bring together a semi-walking with a semi-swimming on semi-frozen bodies of water. And eventually we started having both fun out of it, but also opened up to many more technicities that were attuned to it or took from it. So this attitude of playfulness, for me, it's essentially what is and could be the response to all efficiency, speed, economically driven, let's say, dictates that we might find ourselves against. Or at least constrained in the bad sense of the term. And then in a second line of thinking, it would be how can foster conditions of playfulness in their design practices? How we could foster these conditions of playfulness? And one response that Andrej or I provoke him to give now, and he can take it from there, the basic precondition for playfulness for me is transindividuation. Transindividuation in the sense of you are not alone, never were you alone, don't act as if you are alone. To speculate playfully, you need to encounter the world in all its variety and embrace that encounter. That's the only way you can speculate playfully.
It's just to continue, there's a lovely passage in somebody who is not an architect, but is a music producer, Bran Eno, and he has this line, and I keep repeating it because it makes so much sense. He says, in terms of nourishment, we need to eat, but there was never ever need to do different kinds of very sophisticated cuisines. In terms of movement, we have to go from A to B, but there was never a necessity to go with Anneke to dance. Dancing is gregarious. It's just unnecessary. There is no, we have to cover ourselves to protect ourselves from the weather conditions, but it, we can choose to have a simple sweater or something very elaborate. And he says it is interesting to notice that all the things that are not necessary is something that we would qualify as belonging to culture. So this gregariousness. And recently, Stavros and I have read and commented on the book by an author, Benjamin Labatut, who has written about, the book is called The Maniac, and it, among other things, it discusses the latest developments in artificial intelligence regarding the capacity of computers surpassing that of a human being in playing the game of chess and the game of Go. And if you read it, it was just a matter of moment before this happened. And it would be, it seems to me that it would be a missed opportunity not to approach this. He hasn't done it in the book. This is something that we discussed in our private conversations from the point of view of play, what Stavros was describing earlier. You know, like it seems to me that the human is not not necessarily interested in winning the game per se. It's the how. How do you win? How do you entertain yourself? And I think in that sense, there is indeed this dimension.
There is also a movie there is a movie. Sorry, Andre, but I just you continue again. But there is a movie that follows a similar line, and you might have seen it. It's also on AI, but surprisingly from a book of the brother of William James, 100-something years ago, a short story of Henry James, which is called The Beast. It's a French-Canadian movie which goes also along that line. But a distinctive feature between so-called AI and again, so-called human, because for me both categories are a bit strange, is precisely this absence or presence of playfulness, absence of presence of degrees of rational optimization. If you see the movie, you would understand it's very close to the argument that Andrej is making. The beast is a rational beast.
And this will be, there is a, you know that Baumeister devotes a chapter of the book on to this particular problem. And transindividuation is this moment where the psychic individuation and the collective individuation come together. And there, at that point, we can claim to have an epoch of something that holds things together in this kind of quasi-causal way that I was trying to kind of promote. I hope this is
of course. Thank you.
Okay. We have got another question here from Deborah, and maybe Deborah could ask her question. Deborah, do you like to unmute yourself?
Neil, my connection here is really unstable,
okay.
but I did have a few questions I don't mind asking, but I don't want to show my face because the connection is so unstable. So I apologize, gentlemen.
Oh no,
but
no, it's okay. No, don't worry. You ask your question.
So thank you.
Don't worry about your video. Don't worry.
Okay, thank you so very, very much. Technicity is definitely on my mind, and I never knew your gentleman, so I'm trying to do a deep dive into him. So I apologize. I'm very naive, but I am wondering.
There's as I said it already. He's humble, and he probably won't say it. Stavros has written a book on it, so I strongly recommend it.
I'm trying to get to all of them. So is technicity an ability or a force?
Mm-hmm.
And then the other question I wanted is, are the synapses and the gap you're talking about present as the working memory? The hinge, the gap, the void, the thing. Our minds work with this thing called a working memory. Is that where you place it? And I'm just those two ideas, if you can help me with that. And I am an architect, and the other thought that I have is that behaviors modify the firings. When we're born, we have more synapses than that we lose as behavior modifies those firings. So behaviors are the delimiters of activity. Is architecture making behaviors concrete? Are values and norms behaviors? I mean, where are because every act we make delimits our synapses and our possibilities.
Yep. I can give you the first shot, Andre, right? Yeah, okay.
Addressed to you. You have to take
No, but I mean, for me, it's issues that I share with you anyway. So for me, the first question, ability or force, is, and I'm not trying to avoid it, I would respond both. In the sense that it's both what potentializes and also what propels. So it's both what we can do and also what allows us to do more of the same or more of a different.
maybe it could be related to your distinction between the potential and
potential and potestas is what we have and what we can do with what we have, and what we have and what we can do. They continuously, let's say, inform one another. They continuously determine one another. The other question, which I mean, this is also complex, but I try to respond it very quickly. The other question, which perhaps needs a bit more time, and I have to be very open about it. Whenever I think, and I've written or I've spoken now about synapses, the last, literally, and I'm not lying, the last understanding I have in mind is neurons or brain synapses. That says perhaps more about me than about anybody else. But I don't equate synapses with any particular human brain or merely brain activity. I take it in the most broad operational sense, the most broad sense of a term understood as an operation. I take synapses as things coming together, okay? And in their coming together doing something. In this coming together that does something, the discussion goes into constraints precisely in an almost tautological way. Things need to come together in order for things to start doing things together. How things come together? They first of all come together by excluding other things. So things constrained, and again, the Latin term constringere means constrained. Things constrained, they come together, they touch, they weave, they fold one another. And in that folding, they have decided, being forced, have the potential to not touch another full infinity of things. They have decided to touch, I'm giving a very simplified, let's say, movements with my hand now. They have decided to touch two. One and one together, two. Not everything. I can give more examples from our real life. You are in the car, you are driving, you see the traffic light. There is three constraints in there, which they say red, orange, green. These three constraints synaptically allow you and connect you with at least three potentials for action. You can go ahead even faster if it's orange, or you stop if you're a proper driver, or you can fully stop if it's red, okay? So out of an infinity of actions, three were synaptically brought together with your own continuous action up to that point, which was driving the car. In even perhaps more simplified terms, in order for anything to happen, and in order for anything to happen, not just out of a mere propensity of action, like out of action that just continues to exhaust itself, but for anything to happen that can have a meaningful effect, an infinity of options needs to be taken out of the equation. And out of this infinity, some need to be constrained, deduced, removed. And these are the ones that can allow us to enter up into a synaptic relation, a connection with a new behavior, with a new technicity, you want to call it like that, with a new reading, with a new discussion, with a new thought, with whatever you want to call it.
I think what would be like the purchase pedagogical terms and in terms of architecture, I think at this point it would be maybe helpful to introduce the concept of affect and affordance, affect from Deleuze and Guattari and affordance from Gibson, because it helps us do exactly what Stavros was describing. Out of the almost infinite set of potentials, there is in the way that we see it, architecture perhaps instead of thinking that it produces objects, maybe it's not far-fetched to say that we are modulating the capacity to affect and be affected. And this is purely relational. That is to say, it doesn't exclude, nor does it predetermine what is it that it's going to happen. Let's say that instead of thinking, and this is a very often used example, so but I think it's very evocative. If you think about in the, let's say, conventional terms, that the architect is required to design a chair, the alternative way of thinking about it, synaptic or relational or ecological, would be to think in terms of designing sit on ability. Sit on ability is purely relational insofar as it doesn't preclude what kind of, it has to take into, it is something that has the capacity to affect and engender both, what we would usually refer to as the object and the subject, because it doesn't, it starts from this from middling itself, thinking in terms of capacity before they take a shape, and they will have taken a shape eventually. But I think it gives us a chance to kind of dwell in this kind of potential space, and maybe this is also a way to answer what Michael asked earlier, before committing to something concrete, discrete, with an outline. And I think it's in that sense could be changing course for it. This is what I meant by ecologization of thought. To start with the relation rather than the terms of the relation. It's this kind of inversion when we are really taking seriously the possibility of the exteriority of relation that precedes its relata, its terms.
I understand that like a middle way of seeing it, a new ecology of mind. I get that idea.
Yes.
I guess what I've been looking at in my own mind and thinking about the technicity in the world today, the last question I wanted to ask you is the internet sort of an infancy of our subconscious being projected in a form?
Subconsciously projected?
Is the internet sort of a projection of the subconscious in a Freudian manner, the subconscious in a form?
Is it? I don't know.
I don't know. I'm asking. I don't know. I keep asking. We're doing like this. The internet is like a swarm thing happening, right? It's the first time that we've ever seen this sort of net. We're learning how to be insects, or are we learning to be bees, or we're learning to build this incredible swarm culture that we can't see, but it's another virtual space that's fantastic, broad, huge, incredible, right? It's this extra space, this third space outside of space. So is that sort of becoming a new home for the subconscious?
I'm thinking, very often Delanda makes a point that even though they seem like inversion of each other, one shouldn't confuse a network for meshwork. He says network such as the internet, there are existing points, all of us on the screen that are connected by the protocol, by lines. When he talks about the lines, I think we are getting closer to what Stavros was describing with Rouillet's idea of the fibrous universe, where the lines pre-exist the points. So where the lines come together in the synaptic moment, they produce a point. So maybe I would say that yes, internet is incredibly successful, but it still is arborescent. It kind of there are points that are connected, literally what they say, like connect the dots, and it does connect the dots. But I think in order to maybe come closer to what do we mean by a fibrous universe, we should start from the lines, from the relations that indeed eventually produce their terms. This was also my kind of advocacy of this idea of the exteriority of relations.
I think that helps me understand it, because we're in our infancy, and it's a really poor thing because they're manipulating our biases. They're creating these echo chambers. They're creating so many, how do you say, exploitation of human weaknesses. So I'm curious about the exploitation of the human in the making of technology. And and so these are some interesting relationships, and whether it goes so dark or whether or not it goes transformative, these are very ethical issues that I have. And I was just curious about your thoughts about that overall ethics. And I'll end with that, but to say thank you, bravo, and I'll read all of the books, and I'm trying to learn about technicity as much as I can absorb.
Put it in
just maybe add something to that. I in my book on AI, I refer to a book by a guy called Clint Burnham that is does the internet have an unconscious, and he engages with Slavoj Žižek, and Žižek endorses it. I've heard some criticism of it, but there's a book out there that does make that particular point, and I'm not sure how valid it is. Maybe we've had
one brief thing regarding that. That I'm going to try to be in less than. I'm going to try. I didn't say I will succeed, but I'm going to try to be in less than 2 minutes. It's precisely on that point of the unconscious, subconscious internet technology, because Stiegler, not coincidentally, Stiegler and Andrej touched upon it. Stiegler has some terms that could be helpful in there, and his notion, for example, of first, second, third protension and retention. So first, second, third memory, and first, second, third, I'm going to put it very simply, like desire or a will to do stuff. They're a very interesting entry point in understanding questions that have to do with what Deborah was calling unconscious or subconscious. So, for example, for Stiegler, there's no, let's say, what do we equate the subconscious with, or our unconscious? We equate it basically with the things we are carrying with us, like our memories, and the way that these things determine the way that we decide about the stuff in the sense of what we do, what we want to do, okay? Stiegler is saying that there has to be a nuanced approach into them that breaks them in at least three. And the first one is the immediate memory of our bodies. So when something happens to us, I use an example, I'm going to use it again. It's, I suppose, evocative and quick. You go out on a date, you kiss someone that you like, you start blushing. So you're blushing here in the cheeks is the memory, the initial memory of your body, the first memory of something that happens to you and you find it at least interesting. There is a second memory. You are walking back home and you are using the language that you've been taught by your parents to start thinking what happened, and you are writing a poem, writing in quotes, you're writing a poem in your head about it. You are starting to recite it, okay? That's the second memory. It's you, in a way, with established norms and values, reflecting, I'm putting again quotes, on what has happened to your body. Then there is, and that's the internet question, then there is a third kind of memory, which is a point that, and the moment that you would take your recited poem in your head and you would start writing it down. The moment you write down your poem, you're exteriorizing your memory. You're exteriorizing also your desires. And you are storing it collectively now, technologically, outside of your mind, outside of your body, okay? So writing the poem in a paper or in a typewriter or in a computer or recording your speech means that somebody can go and pick it up 100 years, 1,000 years later on, or they can go and pick it up 100 kilometers far away, or 1,000 or 2,000 or 10,000 kilometers far away. All of this just to say that more than the previous two, the third kind of memories and the third kind of desires generated by this technological exteriorization is precisely an entry point on what the internet does or does not do to our subconsciousness or our consciousness or our unconsciousness. So I would not say that the internet is a projection of any of those things. I would say that the internet and any technology is fundamentally determining those things, is fundamentally determining the ways that we carry our memories and the ways that we elaborate and the ways that we actualize our desires. That's last comment. That's very much in tune with the whole big beef that Deleuze and Guattari had famously with psychoanalysis, because it means that there's no hidden stuff that we need to interpret and project. There's no subconscious or conscious or whatever that is hidden in us, and we just need to find ways to understand it. Everything operates. Everything is operative. Everything is produced. And it's produced not mysteriously. It's produced right here, right now, in writing things down, in speaking on the internet, in ordering from Amazon, in conquering this land, or in getting sick by that disease. That's continuously produced. And it's technologically produced in the broad sense of technology, exteriorizing our beings.
Just one sentence, literally. So with three retentions, three kinds of memories come three pretensions, three ways of looking ahead, appetitions and I think that's a good way to end it, no?
Can I just one quick question, very quick question. At the back of my mind, we're dealing with Zimmel in the final session. I was intrigued by a comment about the speed of change, and I'm not sure it was yours or Stavros's comment, the speed of change in the world of AI. And my particular question is that, I mean, Zimmel refers to, I don't know if you know his essay on Metropolis and Mental Life, where he talks about the blasé individual, the overload of stimulation that forces us to shut down to protect ourselves. And I'm wondering if we can tease out of Stiegler's work, and obviously he hasn't referred to it yet because it's a very new phenomenon we've become aware of, what will happen when this overload happens in the world of AI, to do with not only the saturation of material, of data itself, but the speed at which it's happening, which is going to leave us left behind in some senses. How will the human psyche cope with that condition, which is going to be a very novel condition? How would you think Stiegler might respond to that issue? Maybe just very briefly. I don't want to take too long on that one.
I was thinking we invited a scholar by the name of Stamatia Portanova, who is interested in the notion of time, how time might change in the face of all the changes. And she has given like a part of her talk, and you can find it online, so I recommend it. She says something has happened, and it was the idea of the shortening of the attention span produced TikTok, and they know exactly, I mean, what the format might be. And she says you find yourself, everybody, including people born in the previous century, there's this moment, she says, of like you find yourself that you've just swallowed 3 hours, wasted like 3 hours of time watching something that you can't actually recount, because it's a munching, it's a machine that burns minutes and hours of our time. But she goes into a very beautiful way of describing the genealogy of how is it that we have first needed to synchronize our times. And I've learned from Dan Smith that this is called railroading, because they actually originated in the States. We had to agree on the universal time so that we could, including this, like make an appointment to see each other at 3 o'clock, regardless of wherever you might be in the world, and how eventually this has completely sidelined local times and not chronological times, the times that are unhinged. They don't measure the movement, but actually are capable of producing movement. Again, I want to end on the idea of, with Yuk Hui, the idea that we have to preserve the space for different technologies so that we may produce different.
If I may very quickly, building up to what Andrej said, and also again, apologies to Andrej because he's heard it before, but he's heard most of the things I've said before, so it's okay. For me, this question, both the one of Deborah, but also the one you are using now, closing, Neil, it's a fundamentally political question, but it's a political question that should not be equated with ideology. And I'm not going to explain precisely why. I'm going to explain it very quickly. Politics, even originating from the term polis, the ancient Greek term polis, means the city, okay, the urban. What is the difference between an urban condition and a rural condition? Even nowadays, I mean, nowadays, perhaps even more than other times, infrastructurally wise, the difference is infrastructurally between a house, a lonely house in the prairie, and a block of apartments in a dense city. It's not so great. It's not so different. I mean, in terms of what comes in, what comes out, infrastructurally, they're very much close to one another. What changes fundamentally is levels of complexity. Rural life is much less complex than urban political life, okay? So politics should not be seen ideologically. Politics could and should be seen as a question of dealing with complexity. In the internet discussion, in the digital revolutions discussion, in the discussion of AIs, there is much more complexity entering in an already given complex political situation, okay? How do we politically approach it in a non-ideological manner is very much, again, one of the last questions that Stiegler posed, is a question that has to do with proletarianization, is the question of allowing ourselves time to not reflect, because reflection is psychoanalytical, is again trying to find the meaning. There's no meaning, but is allowing the time to operatively engage with the world in the very way that the world is being made. And that's the most political thing. It's not voting every 4 years. It's not discussing in forums on the internet about who did what in the last newsreel. It's about engaging operatively with the world in the way that the world determines values.
Yeah.
If we lose
that,
we lost it.
Yeah, no, fabulous, fabulous. I somehow think also Andreas Huyssen's work on amnesia needs to be re-evoked in some senses. I think that was a fundamentally important work back in the 80s, I think it was, but so much appropriate, so relevant now today. So anyway, let's wrap up. This has been a fabulous, such a fabulous session. Stavros, Andrej, you set such high standards, and this has been a feast, absolute feast. Thank you so much, and it's really good to see more of this interaction with Delft and via Mikhail and others, let's try and build upon this in the future, because it's really become a very important platform, as you say.
Andrej announced it. If we are here next year, hopefully, I mean, Leibniz is going to be
fantastic.
That's it. I'm not going to say more, but Leibniz is going to be.
Fantastic. That'd be wonderful. I mean, so But thank you so much. I mean, to the bottom of my heart, it was such a it's so rich getting this stuff, so dense. You know, Delft, I think, has become this world center now of debate. It's not just you guys, it's also Heidi and Robert and other people here. It's a fantastic culture of criticism. Even though it's marginal from the university itself, it's really very rich and very, very valuable. Thank you so much. Can I also thank the Digital Futures team behind this, Michael in particular, putting this together, and the posters and all these things have been done. There's a lot of hard work and done selflessly. And it's really wonderful that everyone's sharing their passion for these ideas across the world. We've had some people all over the place today, many in Iran. We've had some in Bangladesh and India and so on. So it's getting out there. And Donna Haraway has over 40,000 on her views. So that was fantastic too. Thank you again. We're going to be next week. We'll be have another session. Just watch out for the time difference between Europe and because I think you guys in Europe changed. We changed today. It's very confusing, but hopefully we'll be back in sync soon. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. Nice seeing you all. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
Stream is over. Thank you, everyone. It's a wrap up.